You can start now.
Welcome to the WTO's annual Agriculture Symposium, which this year is dedicated to the topic of illicit trade in food and food fraud. We've chosen this topic for two reasons. One, because WTO Director General Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has long been committed to the fight against illicit trade, which is a phenomenon that undermines legitimate business activity, fuels corruption, and acts as a drain on government resources. In the case of food fraud, more specifically, it can also endanger human, animal, plant life, or health, as you can imagine. Dr. Ngozi has asked that the WTO Secretariat examine how WTO rules can help countries confront the challenge of illicit trade. Two, because WTO outreach events are an excellent opportunity to connect the WTO rulebook and its agriculture negotiations to broader food policy discussions. This symposium is a two-day event. It will bring together WTO ambassadors, members of the WTO Secretariat, and various experts from international organizations, businesses, civil society, and academia for a deep dive into this topic. The goal is to assess how the WTO rulebook can help the world respond to this challenge. Agreements such as the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, or the agreements on technical barriers to trade or trade-related intellectual property rights, will all be in focus in this two-day event. My name is Doa Abdelmotal. I'm Senior Counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's opening session. It's my hope that this two-day event will be as interactive as possible, and I would encourage viewers throughout the program to send their questions to dialogues@wto.org. And I have another device next to me here through which I'll be monitoring your questions. A few words of intro to the subject matter before I introduce our very distinguished panel to you. Food fraud is the intentional sale of substandard food products or ingredients for the purpose of economic gain. The world has experienced food fraud across many different food and beverage sectors, such as wines and spirits, olive oil, honey, and many other sectors that will be represented in this two-day event. The problem occurs on a significant scale, and I'm sure we will be hearing about this from our speakers in these 2 days. Food smuggling, on the other hand, is a different phenomenon, but no less serious. In general, it's driven by disparity between the price of a good at its origin and its destination. Smuggling results in a significant loss of revenue for governments when taxes, tariffs, import and export duties are circumvented. It can lead also to the introduction of invasive species, disease-carrying pathogens, contaminants that can threaten human health and pose a risk to agriculture, the agricultural economy as a whole, and the trade status of a country's exports and its reputation. The problem of illicit trade in food and food fraud is compounded by illicit trade in seeds, and one of our speakers this morning will be talking to us about that. And it's also compounded by illicit trade in agrochemicals, and specifically pesticides, which are an integral part of conventional agriculture. These sectors, too, will be sharing their experiences with us in this symposium. So what then can we learn about illicit trade in food and food fraud, the prevalence of this phenomenon, its magnitude, its impact, and its connection to world trade? With us today to answer these questions is a very distinguished opening panel, which I would like to introduce to you. Jean-Marie Pogam, Deputy Director General of the World Trade Organization. Hello, Jean-Marie. Antonia Marie De Mayo, Director of the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute, known as UNICRI. Hello, Antonia. Jeffrey Hardy, Director General of the Transnational Alliance to Combat Illicit Trade, Traceit. Hello, Jeffrey. Michael Keller, Chair of the International Agri-Food Network and Secretary General of the International Seed Federation. Hello, Michael. And Michelle Caitlin, Chair of the Electronic Working Group on Proposed Draft Guidelines on the Prevention and Control of Food Fraud of the Codex Alimentarius Commission. Michelle, hello. I'll be putting 2 rounds of questions to the opening panel, after which I'll be taking questions from you, the viewers. I would also like to point out that the WTO will be releasing a publication on this topic very shortly, containing guest contributions from many of the speakers who are with us at this symposium. So stay tuned. Let me now turn to the first round of questions. Jeff, I'd like to start with you for some scene setting, if I may. Can you walk us through the terminology and typology of food crime and how serious the problem is on the international stage? In particular, how does food crime undermine the Sustainable Development Goals? And please take the time to explain what your organization does so that viewers who are not familiar with it can get acquainted. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Doa. Thank you, Jean-Marie, for inviting me and Traceit to participate in this panel. I think there are 3 or 4 questions in that one question, Doa. So let me break that down just a little bit. I'll say a word about Traceit, and then the problem, and then I've got a few words I can offer to embellish what you said about what food fraud and food crime is, and then take the last bit of the time to summarize some of the impacts on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But Traceit as an organization uniquely addresses illicit trade across multiple sectors. So today I'm here working with you on the topic of illicit trade in food or food fraud, but tomorrow we very well may be addressing counterfeiting or falsified substandard medicines, smuggling of alcohol or pesticides, or any wide range of things, including human trafficking and wildlife crime. So we've got our hands full, and what we try to do are look at what are some of the commonalities that enable illicit trade and try to share best practices across those sectors. So it's always a good opportunity for us to work with intergovernmental organizations like the WTO. Our objectives here are to help raise awareness, to promote higher standards for mitigating illicit trade, and to share best practices, with your member states. And I just want to take 1 second to say how pleased that we are with what WTO has done in this space. I mean, around a year ago, the Director General had a similar initiative on pharmaceuticals, especially drawing attention to falsified and substandard medicines. That's excellent work. The WTO's work on eliminating fishing subsidies certainly goes a long way to mitigating illicit trade in fish and IUU fishing. And then, of course, there's TRIPS, which is really the global standard in protecting intellectual property, which is the #1 thing for stopping counterfeiting, which is a global problem. So I'm thrilled and pleased to see WTO taking a leadership position here in agriculture and illicit trade in food. So having said that, I mean, the seriousness of the problem globally really derives from how important the agricultural section is to the global economy, to employment, to feeding the poor. It's just anything that upsets that delicate balance, that economic engine is extremely serious. And I think that's the #1 reason that we have a focus on illicit trade in food. As you mentioned in the introduction, there are other sectors that also play a role here. We're going to get into the importance of seeds, for example, and pesticides. All of these contribute to a greater global food supply and, in turn, greater food security. And illicit, illegal, unauthorized versions of these products, significantly dislocate the economic principles that underlie those 3 industries. So there's a lot of numbers out there. If you look at the losses to the agricultural sector that are associated with illicit trade, we've calculated that somewhere between 30 to 50 billion. If you throw in losses associated with illicit trade in alcohol, which is important to include because of their dependence on the grains that are produced worldwide, you can add another 50 billion in losses. So it's a significant problem economically. And then just sort of dovetailing to the last part of the question, and so I don't take up too much of the time, is how do we look at how deeply those losses impact the economy and society? And one approach that we took at Traceit was to look at how illicit trade undermined the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Because those goals have been around for quite a long time, and they're so valuable because they do really dig deep into, what are the main elements of a good society, a good economy. So we have published a report that's available on Traceit's website. It's going to be one of the chapters in the report that you mentioned. So I'm not going to go, too deeply into all of that right now, but I can quickly tell you that illicit trade in food impacts 11 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So just very quickly, if you look at, if you take SDG 1 and 2 together, which is no poverty and zero hunger, access to healthy food is fundamental to addressing global poverty. So if we can make sure that our food supplies are stronger, we're going to have a better opportunity to preserve the goals of zero hunger. So if you take a look at SDG 3, which is good health and well-being, illicit trade in food exposes consumers to harmful ingredients or deprives them of active beneficial ingredients. Just moving on to SDG 8, which is critical to economic growth worldwide. Illicit trade in food and food fraud siphons GDP, jobs, tax collections from national economies, and introduces risks to the companies and the brands that deliver these foods. I think SDG 12 is an interesting one to look at because that's responsible consumption and production. If you have food fraud that, for example, does not have the ingredient or misrepresents the ingredient, like a kosher or gluten-free product, this deprives the consumers of their choice and their ability to make educated decisions. And the last one that I'll mention really is SDG 16, which is peace, justice, and strong institutions, because what we've learned about food fraud and illicit trade in food is that is driven mostly by criminal organizations. And the one thing that we found in looking at the SDGs across 12 different sectors is that criminal activity is deeply involved in all of these sectors. And I think we'll probably hear a little bit more from that from the speaker from Unicre. But Doa, that's a quick summary of that first question.
That's an excellent summary, Jeff. So 11 SDGs are impacted, and your emphasis on strong institutions is very well placed, because I think consumers lose confidence in the institutions that are supposed to protect their food supply. So thank you for mentioning that. I'd like to turn to you, Michelle. Michelle, you wear two hats. Your international coordination executive for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Food Safety and Inspection Service, and you're also chair of a Codex working group that's developing guidelines on this specific issue. So my first question to you is, in your capacity as USDA, what is the U.S.'s experience with food fraud and illicit trade, and what are the mechanisms you've found to control these phenomena?
Thank you. Thank you, Doa. First, I want to start with thanking WTO and yourself for organizing this important session and for inviting me here to participate in it. As you mentioned, I am with the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service, or FSIS. And I just want to make sure that everyone knows and understands, in the US, we have two different food safety agencies, and FSIS is the one that is responsible for ensuring that meat, poultry, and egg products are safe, wholesome, and properly labeled. So in speaking today, I'm speaking from, when I'm wearing my USDA hat at least, I'm speaking from that perspective, and looking at the food safety around those products. FSIS, like food safety agencies around the world, has to remain vigilant against food fraud and illicit trade. And it can be a major, when it happens, it's a major issue for food safety, because when you have food fraud, you might not have the food that is supposed to be there. So from that perspective, we do take it very seriously. And FSIS does have a number of layers to help prevent and mitigate food fraud. As the food safety agency overseeing the meat, poultry, and egg sector, we have inspectors in every federally regulated establishment, either continually if it's a slaughter facility, or every shift that they are operating if it's a process facility. So that provides a lot of eyes, thousands of eyes out there on the ground to be able to watch and ensure, and sort of both being watchful and also just their mere presence actually helps reduce the possibility for food fraud and the likelihood of it. We also have a compliance and investigation division, and that group conducts surveillance, investigation, and enforcement activities out in commerce for our sector. They investigate reports of potential food fraud, and they can enforce FSIS regulations against food fraud. Now, our agency acts under the authority of a number of acts, the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Poultry Products Inspection Act, and the Egg Products Inspection Act, as well as the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act. And those acts actually provide FSIS with a great deal of authority for criminal, civil, and administrative enforcement action when firms and individuals violate our statutes and regulations, which food fraud would be a violation. So this provides sort of a framework for us as an institution to be able to combat food fraud. We have the ability to take criminal, civil, and administrative actions, enforcement actions, to prevent fraudulent food from coming on the market. Having those authorities not only allows us to take action when it occurs, but it also, because we actively enforce it, it deters future violations to improve food safety and help deter food fraud. When we take administrative actions and enforcement, we can also recommend criminal and civil prosecutions through our Office of the General Counsel and through the Department of Justice. And I think this highlights the need for different agencies in a government to work together using their own enforcement, capabilities to combat food fraud. So with all of these different regulations and working with different government agencies, we do have the framework to be able to deal with food fraud, which I think, going back to what was said earlier, it's very important to have that framework and to use use the enforcement activities we can to maintain the public's trust and the confidence in ourselves as a government agency. I do want to say that as an agency and a government agency, we also have a role to play in making sure that we're developing that framework and keeping it up to date and using the best possible mechanisms to prevent food fraud. And to that end, since I'm sort of the international coordinator, I will highlight one example of what we are trying to do to improve our security around our exports, thereby decreasing the opportunity for food fraud. And one thing we have been doing is moving our export process to a more electronic process where we use digital signatures, and we allow foreign government officials to be able to go in and verify the authenticity of our export certificates in our own FSIS IT system. And not only does this decrease the opportunity for food fraud, but having it in our secure system it allows us not only to decrease food fraud, but also if it were to occur, to be able to identify it and track it much more quickly by having everything electronically. So I think we can, as government agencies, we can do a lot to both deter food fraud and mitigate it when it does occur. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. You've described a vast infrastructure here to deal with the problem, and you've used the words "thousands of eyes," which is very powerful. And I think I'm sure an issue which will come up in this two-day event is the cost of this infrastructure and whether all countries are able to put in place, similar processes to control the global value chain. Michael, I'd like to come to you. Now, we all know that without seeds, there can be no agriculture. So how serious then is the problem of counterfeit or fraudulent seeds? And what does the evidence gathered by the International Seed Federation show?
Thanks so much, Doa, and thanks so much to WTO to put this really crucial topic on the agenda. First of all, today I'm speaking here, Secretary General of the International Seed Federation, but I would like to emphasize directly from the beginning as current chair of International Agri-Food Network, which is representing the 22 representative private sector associations, the whole value chain. I think it's an absolutely crucial topic for all of us. First of all, I think when I'm speaking on seeds today, I think we all know seed is the starting point, and perhaps what is more important, the most critical starting point of the food value chain. That means it's the starting point for good and nutritious food. And secondly, I think we should keep in mind also what the seed sector is doing is empowering farmers on a local level, because each seed needs to be locally adapted. And I think these two points should frame also the thoughts about the importance on why we should all engage on illegal seed practices. And I think more than ever, we need to be vigilant on this topic, because as Jeff mentioned, how many SDGs are concerned. And as Jeff mentioned also, when you're looking on the ground, it's the farmer who would the first suffer also from illegal seed practices. That means as a seed sector, we have this extremely high on our agenda, and we are continuously mapping also all what is around illegal seed practices, which can have very different forms, by the way. And perhaps the most important thing is these illegal seed practices are existing everywhere. Everywhere. In all countries, illegal seed practices can pop up. And we have made also internal assessments showing on given crops in a country, 40% of a given crop can come from illegal seed practice. That means it's showing somehow the magnitude which can have this also for a farmer. And again, it can happen in the diverse range of crops and also in the diversity of geographics. What is important for us to raise today is also the potential consequences illegal seed practices can have. And I think we heard yet also from Michelle and Jeff, there are different actors who are committing illegal seed practices. But for us, the most important thing is we have sometimes difficulties on seeds to get this on the radar of enforcement authorities, or even on the radar of the policy body, to build perhaps also the right enabling environment. Michelle spoke about the eyes. Yes, we need lots of eyes, but we need also lots of understanding what it means, illegal seed practices, which is perhaps not the easiest ones. And there are direct consequences, and therefore it's so important for us to raise the awareness. And I will take perhaps just two examples, two very concrete examples of what can happen. And this is on plant health, and this is also on the seed quality. Because when I'm speaking about seed quality, this is the most important thing when a farmer is buying a bag of seed, that the farmer can trust what is in this bag of seed. Coming back to plant health, it is clear the priority for all of us, and even with climate change, it's even more important, is to keep pests and diseases under control. It means also to keep pests and diseases away from seeds and ensure that seed is not a pathway for pests or diseases. And therefore, it's so critical for the private sector to engage on this. And when you have illegal seed practices, there's no inspections, there's no control. That means there's an extremely high risk that illegal seeds who are going from one country to another can transmit pests and diseases. And you can imagine the impact this can have. And we produced one example also in the chapter where there was a production area in Southern Europe infected by a pest, and which had destroyed somehow the whole area, but also the whole follow-up to build then to get this away. I think these are things perhaps sometimes you don't see the impact directly in the food value chain, but it's extremely crucial when we are thinking about the whole food production value chain. The second one, it's a seed quality. And I think seed quality is the most important thing a farmer is looking when buying a thing. Imagine a smallholder farmer in Africa buying a bag of improved varieties. And then when he is sowing the seeds and would like to harvest, he gets out 1/3 or 1/5 of what he thought. This is not impacting only the food security, but even the livelihood of a farmer. And I think therefore it is so important when I'm always saying perhaps the magnitude is not as high in terms of economics, as high in other sectors. And therefore, it's perhaps under the radar screen. But when we are thinking in a world where we're thinking about food security, and we are knowing exactly we need to increase also production, can that then not be a more important topic also to engage all of us with all of our eyes in fighting against illegal seed practice? It means the seed quality and the requirement of quality and the control process needs to be ensured that we can de-risk for farmers the investment in improved seeds. That means from buying, sowing to harvesting, it is critical that the first step we can all guarantee together that the quality is there. Therefore, with this I will stop, but I just would like to emphasize the importance of this seed as the starting point. And I will come later back on also that this is perhaps locally adapted, but seeds is traded internationally. Back to you, Dora.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you for putting the farmer at the center of your answer. So, you've mentioned how farmers need to have trust in the product that they're buying, and that trust then impacts, of course, what they produce, and it impacts what we all eat, and it impacts starting with plant health. So farmers and the economics of agriculture really at the center of your answer. Thank you very much for that. Antonia, I'd like to come to you. You are director of a pretty unique UN agency. Please explain to viewers what UNICRI does in the food space and walk us through a few concrete examples, if you can, of some of the more serious food crime operations you've seen in recent years. How also comment, please, on how you've seen food crime evolve, perhaps. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for your opening questions, Doa. It's a pleasure to be part of this esteemed opening panel. And of course, thanks to WTO for this excellent initiative. As a research and training institute, UNICRI has a program on organized crime and counterfeiting, and food fraud is a key aspect of this work. We look into the criminal phenomena that is linked to food fraud to better understand how and to what extent organized crime is involved. What's its modus operandi, the connection to other crimes, and how can criminals profit from these illicit activities? When we first started this work in 2008, we analyzed concrete cases of food fraud to understand how the criminals operate in the field. We considered the strategies, techniques, and tools used by law enforcement to investigate and prosecute food fraud criminals. And we quickly realized just how varied the criminal landscape is and the numerous ways criminal organizations can commit food fraud. At the local level, criminal operations can acquire control of legitimate food distributors and businesses and then use them to put fraudulent or substandard food products into the market for profit. Or they can coerce restaurants and bars to use specific food ingredients supplied by them in lieu of protection money. Now, these kinds of activities damage the food supply chains and also the local economies. The main complexity comes from the fact that food fraud criminals do not follow a standardized approach. They use diverse tactics, and the perpetrators of food fraud range from an individual setting up a small illegal operation to a full-fledged criminal organization. But most food fraud criminals share one common element. They need to deceive the consumers by presenting fraudulent food products as genuine. Beyond this common aspect of deceit, however, each case of food fraud is unique, and law enforcement need to tailor their investigative techniques and strategies to arrest the criminals and build the elements of the criminal case in accordance with national legal frameworks. UNICRE's objective is to share key information and best practices with law enforcement to support them in successful investigations and prosecutions of food fraud cases. Our first step is always to work with law enforcement agencies, Europol and Interpol, to identify concrete cases we can analyze and translate into good practices to disseminate across law enforcement networks. And in this way, UNICRE has uncovered how criminal organizations have infiltrated legitimate supply chains with fraudulent food to obtain easy profits by defrauding consumers. UNICRE is keen to ensure that our research on food fraud leads to practical recommendations that can be applied by member states, international organizations, and civil society. And we aim to improve the effectiveness of law enforcement and criminal justice in this field and overall improve public safety. Now, let me give you two concrete examples of food fraud cases. The introduction to today's program mentioned olive oil, honey, baby formula, and alcohol. Almost any food item can become the target of food fraud when criminals figure out a way to make an illegal profit from the specific food supply chain. So we need to keep in mind that what is most important is not the type of food or beverage, but rather the nature of the criminal operation. So, for example, there's a relatively simple case that involved alcohol where individual criminals substituted ethanol with a cheaper ingredient. But by doing that, they made the beverage poisonous. They sold their poisonous mixture to an unscrupulous distributor who then resold it as genuine with wide distribution. This case was easy to implement by just a few people at the top of the distribution chain, but it had grave consequences for the public, including deaths. Another case, which is much more complicated, involved counterfeit baby formula that was sold online on a large scale in several countries. Now, this was organized crime, and organized crime used a network of local distributors who packaged the fake baby formula in counterfeit packaging of different kinds of name brands that had been ordered by the consumers online. They bypassed health and safety regulations in multiple different countries and introduced contamination into the supply chain. This was a complex case with sophisticated operations that harmed the nutrition of many young children in multiple countries. Lastly, just a few words on the evolution of food crimes. There are many food fraud cases, but we don't know if the increased number of cases related to a wide variety of food products indicates an actual increase in criminal activity or just an increase in monitoring the criminal activity. It's well known that increased attention brings more cases to light, and we definitely know about a lot of cases. What is certain is that criminals nowadays target any product in the market across borders. And that means that effective collaboration across and within borders is critical, as is increased coordination to combat the role of organized crime. And I'm going to go ahead and stop here, Doa, and return the floor to you. Thank you so much.
Antonia, this was a fantastic answer as usual. I'm particularly struck by your opening sentence that criminality does not follow a standardized approach. So that shows just how difficult it is for the regulator. Regulators are chasing the unknown. They're chasing a moving target, hence the challenge here. Jean-Marie, I'd like to turn to you. You've now heard all of the other speakers. The WTO rulebook is designed to create a framework for trade in goods and services that are legal under national and international law. So how does the WTO rulebook interact then with the question of illicit trade in food and food fraud?
Thank you, Doa, and thanks to all the speakers for the very impacting first reactions to your questions, which give us a very good sense of the magnitude of the problem. Before I directly answer your question on the rule book, let me maybe state the obvious, which is about the nature of the WTO. WTO is an intergovernmental organization which has for mission to negotiate and elaborate the rules of international trade. So what I would like to say is that by definition, our DNA is legal trade. And a little bit like in physics, you have the matter and the antimatter. We are the matter of legal trade, and illicit trade is the antimatter. So just the fact that we exist and that our members want to strengthen it is a first way to combat illicit trade and fraud. The second one is, I'd like to be cautious on this, but it has to do with the fact that our negotiation deal with market incentives. We are an institution which proposes disciplines to international trade, but also proposes to facilitate and liberalize trade, especially in the field of agriculture and food product, where the objective of our agreement is to establish fair and open trade in agricultural products. So why I'm saying that is that because sometimes when you have border mechanisms which are conducting to raising the price of legal product, you might have incentives created implicitly for illegal products. So lowering the barriers to trade is also a way of disincentivizing illegal trade. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting here that there is one size fits all or only one way to combat, and sometimes prohibition or regulation are going to be the right instrument. But I'm just mentioning the fact that sometimes market instruments like lowering the price of legal goods is also a way of reducing the incentives to illegal trade. The third element that I'd like to make is more directly related to the rule book. Of course, the rule book, and I think Jeffrey at the beginning has been mentioning several aspects of this. All our rule book is directly or indirectly related to legal trade or disincentivizing illicit trade. Now, just let me mention, for instance, 3 agreements which are directly relevant to border operation, where you can catch and help catch illicit trade and prevent it. One is our custom valuation agreement, which aims for a fair, uniform, and neutral approach to the valuations of goods for custom purposes. And applied correctly and consistently by custom officers, it can help weed out fraud. Another one has to do with what we call pre-shipment inspection agreement. Pre-shipment activities are all the activities which are relating to the verification of the quality, the quantity, the price, the currency exchange rate, and the custom classification of goods which are to be exported. And once again, used effectively, it helps reduce the scope for fraud, corruption, and a whole range of illegal activities. Of course, we have a trade facilitation agreement, like its name suggests, is here to facilitate, smoothen everything which has to do with legal trade, and implicitly disincentivize illicit trade. We have others. I may come back to them. For instance, the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement has already been mentioned, but I'll stop here for the sake of the time in the discussion. So thank you, Doa. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, and I love how you started your comments with matter and antimatter and the role of the WTO. I think that sort of makes crystal clear the distinction between what the WTO tries to do and all this illegal activity that occurs. But the WTO, as you mentioned, has a toolbox that can help in this fight. So thank you very much for these comments. I'd like to open the second round of questions, if I may. Jeff, I'll come back to you. From Traceit's standpoint, have globalization and international trade in food and longer supply chains essentially increased the complexity of food fraud?
Yeah, thanks, Doa. The answer is yes. That's a pretty easy one. In fact, Traceit just published a couple of weeks ago a new study where we were looking at how the global supply chain actually facilitates illicit trade. It's the vulnerabilities, I should say. We looked at 4 or 5 different hotspots, online platforms, maritime and air transport, the global postal system, and the express delivery and free trade zones. These are all hot spots. These are all critical parts of the legal global supply chain that are vulnerable to exploitation by illicit traders across all 10 of the sectors that we work in. So we published that report, and a lot of that's relevant to what we're talking about today. Let me just give you, I've got 5 little quick points here that I can share that give you an idea of what we're talking about here. The first is, over the last 20 years, the global trade has really become global trade, right? So the first vulnerability is that the longer supply chains, create more points of vulnerability, more opportunities for different ingredients to be added, different components to be added, different players to be added, which just creates additional opportunities for criminals. Like Antonio says, it could be criminal groups, but it could be opportunistic criminals, which are smaller actors, to take advantage of the far-flung supply chain. I think the second point really is the sheer volume of trade in the food sector. As the global food market truly becomes global, different products are originating in different parts of the world and ending up, on the other side of Earth. So this makes it much more difficult to trace the origin and the authenticity of the products. I think thirdly is, since there are so many, ports and free zones and all types of different, trade routes that overall increase the efficiency and lower the cost of final products to consumers, it's also a chance for the criminal groups to conceal origin or falsify certificates of origin or misdeclare shipping documents. All of those things are very custom oriented. There's so many things that are going on, and the criminals have a good idea of how to play that system against the legal traders. I think another thing I wanted to highlight is that, there's different regulatory standards, different rules, different enforcement capabilities in different countries. That adds to the complexity and that creates more vulnerabilities. And I think last thing is economic pressures. Higher prices in one market, can create, demand for diversion or for smuggling, for example. If taxes are too high or if market pressures are too high, it creates incentives. I think certainly one of the cases that we deal a lot with is the illicit trade in alcoholic beverages. Those are heavily taxed industries, and sometimes those taxes, whether they're domestic excise taxes or whether they are import levies, that can significantly raise the price of the consumer of the final product, and that creates price arbitrage opportunity for criminals to smuggle the product in, and give consumers much lower priced alternatives. Unfortunately, those alternatives are illegal. In some cases, they are lethal in terms of consumer health. But Doa, that's just a quick summary of how illicit food trade is affected by the global supply chain.
Thank you very much for this, and thank you for using the word hotspots of vulnerability. In fact, I think that's how we need to think of this as we go forward in this discussion at WTO. There are hotspots of vulnerability along a trade route, from, as you mentioned, ports, free zones, etc. And I think it's a sort of a useful way of organizing our thoughts on this subject and connecting it to trade. So thank you for this, Jeff. Michael, I'll come to you. In the fight against seed fraud, what does the private sector expect from the WTO? And does the WTO have a role to play in this space, in your view?
Yeah, thanks, Dora, so much. First of all, absolutely, WTO has a role to play. And let me say it like this. We mentioned before, no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes out to the diversity also of infringers. One-size-fits-all solution, no one-size-fits-all solution. That's also for seeds. Because in a world where you have hundreds of thousands of improved varieties, which should be accessible also to farmers everywhere, you can imagine the risk also we are exposed to, that infringers are entering the seed value chain. And let me make the point, besides the fact that perhaps it's understood and not well rated, there's no private sector, no industry out there, more or less, who is investing more in terms of turnover into research and development. Nearly 30% seed companies investing again into research. What means we are investing into research in 100 different forms. But the important one is the seed value chain is several years from the moment you are starting to research on a variety, go to the market. It can be 10 to 15 years. You can imagine the risk in the whole seed value chain that an infringer is entering into this. And the second thing, and that's really crucial, and therefore I think WTO has a role to play, seeds is internationally moving. It's today 4 times more than some years back. When I'm saying this, in a world where you have more and more climate change impact, in a world where we need to offer more and more choice to farmers, we need also to be able to diversify our capacity of seed production, for instance. Let me just give this example. You imagine we are producing something in the southern hemisphere for the northern hemisphere, and vice versa. Because why? We need to secure seed production because of climate change impact. I was recently in Bangladesh and elsewhere. The impact of climate change today is everywhere. And you can imagine when there's one seed production hub which is impacted, this can have an impact on the whole value chain. But it means also there's a diversity of seed production in different geographic zones. That means seeds is moving. And one single seed, from the moment from research to the market to a farmer, can cross every region in the world, can cross 7 or 8 countries in different parts of the world. That means that's where we are thinking also, yes, there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but we need exactly this one-size-fits-all solution for the farmer. And therefore, we need to have the capacity also to move the seeds. And therefore, we need to think across borders and also within borders, how we can increase the fight against illegal seed practice, how we can also increase the understanding of enforcement authorities of the importance, even if, for instance, giving them only one variety is, for instance, infringed. One variety, it's super small market, but again, the impact for the farmers in the country can be very high. And what I mentioned before, pests and diseases. That means that's where we think WTO, yes, important to increase understanding. Things are moving around the world, but also within the countries, how we can also work with the enforcement authorities, with the judges together to increase the understanding of this importance and build perhaps also this more collaborative effort, awareness, collaboration, and also engagement of all the actors is absolutely critical. Back to you, Dora.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that. And you're absolutely right. You know, it can take years for research and development in the seed sector, and you know, then comes in a legal seed to undermine all that. So you know, just the number of years and the amount of investment that it takes to produce seeds can be very seriously undermined by this practice. Michelle, I'd like to come back to you. And in the second question, I'd like to ask you, in your capacity as chair of the Codex Electronic Working Group on proposed draft guidelines on the prevention and control of food fraud, a mouthful, what those guidelines can achieve in your view, and how far along Codex is in these negotiations. Also, how will those new guidelines interact with the existing Codex, Code of Ethics for international trade in food?
Yes, thank you. And there's a lot of questions in there, and I'm actually going to start with your last question about the interactions of the new Codex guidelines that are being worked on with the existing Codex Code of Ethics for international trade in food. So the Codex document on the ethics for international trade in food, it is from 1979, and it is still very valid. And it established principles for the ethical conduct of international trade in food, including a very basic principle that in order to protect the health of the consumers and ensure fair practices in the food trade, international trade in food should be conducted such that all consumers are entitled to safe, sound, and wholesome food, and to protection from unfair trade practices. So that gets at the two very important aspects of Codex around food safety and unfair food trade and unfair practices. So in contrast to those very basic principles, the current guideline being worked on, and that's as you said, the mouthful of the proposed draft guidelines on the prevention and control of food fraud. They are being developed to provide more concrete guidance to competent authorities and to food business operations on the detection, prevention, mitigation, and control of food fraud to help protect the consumers and to ensure fair practices in food trade. And although when you look through a lot of the Codex documents, there are a lot of aspects related to food fraud that are already addressed in many existing Codex documents, including the ethics document. But this new guidance is intended to help support or supplement those existing Codex texts by providing additional specific guidance to food fraud that national food control systems can consider. So it's sort of a supplement and more specific. With respect to how far along we are in the Codex negotiations, at the last plenary session, and this is another food mouthful, of the last plenary session of the Codex Committee on Food Import and Export Certification and Inspection, or CC-FIX, that's the specific Codex Committee that is working on this guidance document. At their last plenary session in May, the draft that's being worked on by the Electronic Working Group it stayed at step 3 in the Codex process. So with that step, and what happened at that meeting is there's general agreement on a number of the sections of the document, but there are a few sections that are still being actively discussed. So the Electronic Working Group will be working on those sections and the overall document. And at the next CC-FIX meeting, which will be held in September of next year, the Environmental Working Group will present sort of another version of that document with the hope and expectation that it will be able to be adopted and then sent up to the Commission for finalization and formal adoption. With respect to what these guidelines can achieve, once they are finalized, I hope that these guidelines will delineate the roles and responsibilities of competent authorities as well as business operators and also that they will provide some concrete actions that those two different groups can take in order to help detect, prevent, mitigate, and control food fraud. I want to point out that with this being guidelines, that will be recommendations and not sort of requirements, but we hope that there will be some very concrete recommendations in there. And I do also want to point out that you've heard a number of the speakers mention that, one size doesn't fit all. And Doa, you actually mentioned that, we have thousands of eyes on the food supply here and from FSIS's perspective, but that's not the case around the world. And so we really want to make sure that the recommendations that are in this guideline are being developed with an aim to fit the needs of all the different countries around the world, so that they have that sort of ability to not be one size, but be able to fit for everyone. And as well, there is a recognition that the amount of effort and resources being put into food fraud really needs to sort of depend on the risk for food fraud as it is at a given time. And, different products might be more at risk for different reasons. So we really want to make sure that they have that aspect of adjusting the effort to the risk for a given product and situation. So given all of that, it is my hope that the guidelines will provide very practical recommendations that countries around the world can use and adopt that will decrease the likelihood and or the consequences of food fraud when it occurs on a global, in the global world. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you for walking us through all of the architecture of the Codex standards. Of course, the Codex Alimentaris Commission is one of the standardizing bodies that is referenced in the WTO Agreement on Sanitary and Phytosanitary Measures. So for us, it's particularly important to come to grips with what is being developed in Codex. Antonia, I'd like to come back to you with a question that I'm sure our audience by now is burning to ask. So how do we mitigate food fraud? And what are some of the most successful strategies that UNICRE has seen? Also, I'd be curious to know if you think that there's a role for the WTO to play in this, for customs officials, for instance, as food crosses international borders.
Great, thank you. So the most important priority to mitigate food fraud is to raise awareness among the public about food fraud, because the criminals are taking advantage of their ability to deceive unsuspecting consumers. And this point about raising awareness is something that's been mentioned by, I think, all of the speakers so far. We need to educate consumers to purchase food only from legitimate sources, but the boom of e-commerce makes this even more difficult since consumers purchase more and more food online. Now, of course, there are legitimate online food sellers, but there are also criminals using online platforms to sell fraudulent or counterfeit food products. And consumers need to know how to make smart choices when they're buying their food online. It's also really important to continue capacity building with law enforcement, and I'm also building upon a couple of the comments from some of the other speakers, because the role of organized crime can be hidden behind a very complex web of illicit activities, on and offline. Law enforcement need to recognize that food fraud is one of a group of crimes that is often used by organized crime to increase their illicit profits and diversify their income streams. So when law enforcement identifies an organized criminal network, they should always look to see if food fraud is at play among the various criminal activities of the organization. Interestingly, several countries have established cyber patrols to investigate food fraud and other kinds of crimes online. And cyber patrols can be preventative. They can be used to request e-commerce platforms to take down fraudulent food products that are hosted by them. Of course, we know that the same sellers can replicate their offerings many times, or they can post it under multiple usernames. But if the investigation tracks the online seller, then it can produce evidence that's important for a criminal case. Also, the progressive use of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence by cyber patrols can also better prioritize the targets and identification of suspicious online food offerings. In Italy, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture can directly scan the web and e-commerce platforms to identify fraudulent offerings and then request their removal. As we work together to improve the effectiveness of law enforcement and the security of food supply chains, innovation and technology play a really important role. And UNICRI has looked into technological approaches to secure food supply chains and counter food fraud. We work with law enforcement agencies, Europol, Interpol, and we designed risk scenarios that illustrate how criminals operate in the field. And then we worked with technology experts to identify innovative solutions aimed at countering the actual criminal threats. And now we're in the process of sharing this information with interested stakeholders in the field. And we've already, for example, organized regional meetings on this research in Africa and Asia. So we really need a combination of different efforts to improve law enforcement responses to food fraud around the world, ranging from training and awareness raising to concrete identification and sharing of good practices and innovation tools and approaches, also in relation to e-commerce in cyberspace. You also asked me about the role of customs as food crosses international borders. Now, customs officers are often called the first line of defense against the infiltration of illicit products into a country. And in the specific case of food fraud, into the legitimate food supply chain. So similar to law enforcement, we need to cooperate and coordinate to provide better tools and analytical instruments to empower the customs officers as well as field inspectors so that they can identify fraudulent food products in their daily operations. And again, it's awareness raising, specialized training, and new technological tools that can improve the identification of illicit goods at borders. Each member state should assess the ability of their law enforcement and their customs to prevent and combat food fraud on their territory and at all of their borders. And by working together, we can limit the spread of food fraud and its negative consequences for unsuspecting consumers and the public at large. Thank you. Back to you, Doa.
Thank you very much, Antonia. So a combination of methods, which have to start with awareness raising, because if people don't even acknowledge the problem or not aware of the problem, they will not begin to fight the problem. But I think in what you've said here of particular interest to our trade audience is that customs are the first line of defense. So I'm sure that will be a big take-home message for us from this session. Jean-Marie, I'd like to come to you now. Once again, you've heard from all our invited guests what they have to say about this very complex issue. Can the WTO book, in your view, assist not only with the control of food fraud, but also with its prevention? In addition, the WTO rulebook is, of course, evolving. It's going into new areas like e-commerce, investment facilitation, and more. Could these areas provide further ammunition in the fight against fraud?
Well, thank you, Doa, and thanks everyone again for the fascinating input that you are bringing. The notion that we have in the WTO when we consider this question of food crime echoes what you have been saying here. That is, we have in mind these notions of dilutions or substitution of ingredients of a product, concealment of the product origin or the product content, and or the false or misleading labeling, all that type of thing. And of course, it has been pointed out already, and I think you did, Doa, that there is a strong logic in the international architecture of which is underpinning the legal trade. And of course, the Codex Alimentarius is the underpinning of a lot of the discipline that we also apply in the WTO. The heart of the engine for the WTO lies in 2 or 3 agreements, I believe, which have to do with what we call technical barriers to trade. So it's sanitary and phytosanitary measures and the technical barrier to trade agreement. And these agreements allow governments to regulate food imports based on science. So, for instance, international standards based on the Codex Alimentarius, or risk assessment techniques, and then allow them to ensure conformity of imports with national rules and regulation. And therefore, any dilution, substitution, concealment, or unimproved enhancement is being tackled indirectly in the WTO in the framework of these agreements, which help ensure compatibility of the different types of measures which are being taken by the members. The WTO has another important block of disciplines, which is, of course, the Agreement on Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights, which creates a path for WTO members to protect the intellectual property content of their traded goods, including brand names, and give them the legal tools to combat infringements. And just as Codex Alimentarius, we do import in the WTO the norms which are being developed elsewhere in the international governance, in that case at WIPO. Now, interestingly, I think it's Michel and Antonia who had been mentioning the increasing role of electronic commerce in both in the dissemination of illicit products, but also the way to combat them. And it happens that we have a plurilateral negotiation started on e-commerce at the WTO, which might be another avenue in the future to help enhance this fight against e-commerce, against not e-commerce, illicit trade. And of course, it's up to our members to put the bar or put the needle where they want it to be put between liberalization and disciplines, and bring all the topics that they want to regulate within that type of negotiation. But I think we really have here an opportunity to enhance the tools that the WTO proposes in terms of bringing the discussion to another level with e-commerce. Finally, just let me mention also that we do offer to our member technical assistance in the implementation of the rules, and I think it's very important, especially for this role of the custom officers as the first line in the fight, where our discipline can be mobilized. We work together with organizations like FAO and, of course, the World Custom Organization in proposing that. So there is. Well, I think there is quite a bit of coherence in the architecture that we have in common, and I'll stop there. Thank you. Back to you, Doa.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie, for setting out all the avenues, really, that exist in the WTO rulebook for addressing this issue, including the technical assistance, of course, that the WTO provides. We have a lot of questions from viewers, and we have about 20 minutes. So I will, I think, in the interest of time, because there's more than one question for each of you, so I will immediately put two questions, let's say, to each of you, and I would ask you to be very brief in responding so the others have a chance to do so as well. Jeff, I'll start with you. There's a question from India that says the following: given that Traceit works on illicit trade across a range of different sectors, how does the food industry compare to other sectors? That's question number one. And question number two is from Geneva, and it says, how can we boost cooperation across borders?
Okay. Thanks again. How does it compare? Well, I think we're still collecting information across, like I said, 10, 11 different sectors about the magnitudes. And every time we're talking about tens of billions and sometimes hundreds of billions. So let me say something else. I think the situation with illicit trade in food is going to worsen rather than get better. It's going to get worse before it gets better. I think that there's some sorts of illicit trade that have been around for a long time. I think criminals are finding better ways to exploit this gigantic sector that touches all parts of the world. So I think that's what I want to say, that I think it's going to get worse. And what was the other question?
The other question is on how we can boost cross-border cooperation, in your view.
Well, there, I think you have an important role to play. And there was something I was eager to respond to that Jean-Marie had mentioned, right, on how legal trade is intended to, give developing countries, for example, an opportunity to benefit from globalization. Whereas the flip side of that coin, the black side of that coin, is that illicit trade undermines those goals. I think that in Geneva, this question came from Geneva, I think that there's a great opportunity for the WTO and for the UN Conference on Trade and Development to work more closely together on this. We certainly spent some time working with UNCTAD. I think they're an excellent policy-making body that can address issues on the policy side, and working together with you. You can do a combination of better policies and rules to implement those policies. Because in the end, it's the national governments who need stronger laws in place. And those laws are not just, addressed to customs and stronger border control, which is the root of the question, but also I think it's those national governments need to have tighter controls on the intermediaries that we talked about earlier. Antonia mentioned that, we need to raise awareness of the consumer, the end consumer. Well, I think that's definitely critical. But we have to go back up the supply chain, and the next place up that supply chain are the retailers. As I think in food fraud, the retailers need to have better defenses in place, food defense. They need to better understand who they're buying from and where those vulnerabilities come from. So not just then know your customer for that seller, but then where are those vulnerabilities that we talked about on the supply chain, for bad ingredients, falsified ingredients to come into play, or even, bad seeds. Okay. So I think there's a lot that can be done. I think that Geneva has a good role that can be played at this point.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Michelle, I'll move on to you. 2 quick questions. A viewer from the US is saying, you've described how the US prevents fraud in its exports. What about placing inspectors abroad in the countries that the US trades with to ensure that fraudulent imports and fraudulent food does not arrive to US shores? And that's question number 1. Question number 2 comes to you from the World Customs Organization, where somebody is asking what the stumbling blocks are, the main stumbling blocks in the new negotiations on the Codex draft guidelines. Where are the problems? Where do the problems lie? Over to you.
Okay, thank you for those 2 questions. Okay, for the first question about placing U.S. inspectors abroad to protect the food supply coming in. This, I want to preface, I'm speaking from FSIS within USDA, not the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, which has a different model, and the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, which has yet another different model. But for FSIS, we do not have inspectors placed abroad. We have 2 overseas offices, but they are not sort of inspectors. What we do from an FSIS perspective is, rather than place inspectors in all the countries around the world, we do follow an equivalence model, which is consistent with WTO agreements and with Codex guidance, where for meat, poultry, and egg products, countries are only allowed to export those products to the United States if we have evaluated their inspection system and come to the conclusion that their inspection system provides the same level of public health protections as the FSIS inspection system, so that it's equivalent. So that's sort of one prong of our inspection or protection for imports into the United States. We also have a system where our products that are coming in, the FSIS regulated products, After they clear customs, they need to go to a further inspection by FSIS inspectors at what's called an import house. So we have that protection there as well. So based on sort of these multi-pronged approaches to having our imports come in, that provides the protection for the imports into the US rather than having to place inspectors around the world, because we do have this strong equivalent system and import system in place. With respect to the stumbling blocks with the Codex document, I won't go into too much detail. I will say, as many of you know, Codex documents, they can get down in the weeds, and there can be lots of discussions over specific wording of very specific single words. So, but I will say one of the stumbling blocks is around the scope and geographic indicators and how that interplays with the food fraud document. And then also some of it is just making sure that there's not too many redundancies in the document, as well as making sure that it does have the flexibility to be, you know, useful to countries around the world, and does have that sense of having it risk-based for the measures fitting the risk. So it's not a one-size-fits-all. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Michael, a viewer from, I believe this is Vietnam, is asking whether the main form of fraud for seeds lies in intellectual property infringements, or are there other types of fraud, they're asking. And a question from Geneva is whether technology can be used to protect against fraud in the seed sector.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dor. Yeah, we have a diverse range, and therefore we call it illegal seed practices, because it's such a huge range of somehow infringement. And I will name perhaps a couple of them. We have intellectual property infringements, which can be an illegal reproduction of seeds and plant varieties protected by plant breeders' rights. It can be also packaging of illegally propagated seeds, for instance, or it can be an unauthorized import or export of protected varieties. And it can be also an infringement of trademarks, which is also something which can happen. And on top of this, we have regulatory offenses, which is then mislabeling, for instance, of seed bags with false variety names, which are not even existing. Or it can be selling of seeds with false seed certificates, which can be seed certificates by governmental authorities who never made this seed certificate. And it can be commercialization of seeds of not registered varieties in a country. That means, you see, the range is extremely large. And this is also perhaps the difficulty we have concerning the raising awareness of the importance of fraud with regard to seeds. And therefore it is important also that what we just mentioned, it's not only customs. We need its international framework. We need to work with a diverse range of actors also, from the policy side, judges, enforcement authorities. I think that's where we need to think a little bit also out of the box, how we can increase the understanding at the end. Now, can technology help? Yeah, perhaps. In any case, I think I give you just an example. What we are working on very importantly is also on the seed bags. To secure better seed bags with diverse range of logos and all these modern things you can do in order to avoid that everybody can just print a seed bag and sell it. I think this is absolutely something very important. But also what is important is also digitalization is extremely important, also between the authorities, but also between the seed companies and the authorities. And I think here we are not entering in this today, the discussion, but I think we learned a lot also during COVID, how we could dematerialize also the whole flow of seeds, which can help us also to increase the protection. Just something comes back to you, Dora.
Thank you very, very much. Antonia, we have a question from a viewer in Nigeria who is saying, how can a fraudster expect not to be caught if they poison the food supply? So that comes from Nigeria. The second, it's a question/comment. And the second question to you from Geneva is, are you seeing any improvement in how countries are now fighting fraud? Does your research show that there are better approaches now being implemented?
Great, thank you. So first of all, the first question, how can a fraudster expect not to be caught? Well, actually, I think a lot of organized crime does not expect to get caught. Organized crime is very sophisticated, and depending on how they are entering the food supply chain, they are often able to conduct their business in a way that is hidden. This is why they're so effective at what they do. The other thing is that in general, criminals are some of the most innovative people in all of society. And to some degree, if you just look at it from the perspective of innovation, it's something we can actually learn from. But they apply that innovative, creative thinking to how they do their business. So criminal networks are often several steps ahead of crime. And it's one of the challenges that we always have in this industry, is that we're always playing catch up to try to learn what the criminals are doing and then figure out how we're going to respond to them. The second thing is, are there any improvements? Yes, there are some improvements. Certainly, I mean, I gave an example from Italy on how it's doing its cyber patrols, for example. So there are certain countries that are really leading in the advancements in this particular field and how they address it. The problem is, as many of the speakers have mentioned, this is a global market. So having improvements in a few countries, when you're looking at a global market, we need to raise the entire awareness and the entire capacity across the market. But yes, one of the things that Unicre does is try to magnify those good practices and best practices from different countries around the world, exactly so that we can learn from them and we can all become better at fighting food fraud. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Jean-Marie, there are two questions for you. One is from the wines and spirits sector, and they're saying they really want to interact with the WTO on the question of fraud. What are the opportunities for industry to interact with the WTO? That's question number one. Question number two is from Mexico on your expectations for NC13 and the agriculture negotiations.
Well, thank you very much. On the first question, of course, the traditional way of interaction with the WTO is through the government. It's an intergovernmental organization. But it happens that we have more and more occasions of public-private exchanges on specific issues. For instance, you may remember that during the COVID time, we have had a lot of discussion with private sector of the pharmaceutical companies to discuss about the vaccines on COVID. We do that today on international standards for green steel. So we can create those opportunities for direct discussions and exchange, which are not negotiations, of course, this is for our members to do, but which are opportunity to enlighten, to inform, to raise awareness, as Antonia was suggesting, global awareness. It happened that in the case of the wine sector, I have had myself several occasions of interacting directly with the International Organization for Wine, even recently, and I'm really happy with all the teams of the WTO to do better. The other question on the MC13, I'm really happy that this question pops up because, of course, there are two ways of looking at what the WTO can do. The first one, maybe I commented it before, is a little bit static. When I say by nature, transparency, non-discrimination, opening of the market, all that contributes to fighting illicit trade. But there is also a dynamic way of looking at it, which is what our negotiations are supposed to be doing and are doing in terms of market opening, reforming the subsidies to agriculture, which are elements which can be repurposed in a way which will be more favorable to reducing the cost of illicit trade and improving the tools for fighting illicit trades. And I think to a certain extent, the agricultural negotiation of MC13, where we expect an impulse or an impulsion or an impetus to be given to the agricultural negotiation, which have been stalled for so many times. CMC13 can be referred to what we have already done in the fisheries sector. For instance, last year we reformed the subsidies to the boats which are practicing illegal fishing. So illegal fishing is, of course, directly linked with illicit trade of fish. So then you have an example where you can reform subsidies which help do the wrong thing and try to repurpose them to do the good thing. And this is exactly what we hope, at least at the Secretariat, for MC13 as some sort of direction to be given to future negotiation in terms of market opening. And all that will be going into the right direction, that is minimizing the cost of illicit trade and optimizing the benefits of legal trade. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. And I want to thank each and every one of you. We've now come to the end of the opening session. I think we've learned a tremendous lot from all of you. And clearly, this is just the opening salvo and the beginning of a conversation on this very complex topic. We have a publication coming out on this soon, and we really hope to continue with your help this work next year. I want to thank all of our viewers who have sent questions from across different time zones. So thank you for staying with us and being with us. Let me just mention that after this session, the next session of this symposium will start at 4 p.m. CET, so that's Geneva time, using this very same web link. So we look forward to seeing you in approximately half an hour for the next session of this event. Thank you once again to the opening panel. You've all been terrific. Goodbye.
Bye.
Hello, Quincy.
Hi, Doug. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Very well, thank you.
Right, shall I turn my camera on, make sure it works? Let's see.
I'm on mute. Sorry, you're on mute too.
Yeah, there we go. Now I'm also unmuted.
Okay,
So
just
did
check.
the other session finish early?
No, it finished exactly on time.
Oh, okay, excellent. Good. You got muted again, though. So did I. It looks like it does that automatically.
My apologies. Okay, that should work. We will start in exactly 20 minutes, so you can now turn off your camera and your mic and do other things. I just wanted to check your connection.
Yeah, everything seems fine at this end. So I'm
Perfect.
good. I'm good to go.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, John.
Good. Hold on. Good morning. Good day. Good day, I should say.
Good morning. Excellent. I just wanted to make sure that we can hear you before the session starts. So it looks like you're connected and everything is good. We
Good.
will start in exactly 20 minutes, John.
Okay.
We're already being live streamed because we're in between two sessions.
Gotcha.
So everything we're saying now is already going public.
Hey, welcome. All right. We'll watch
Okay.
our. Okay.
See you in a bit.
I'll go on mute. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
Hey, Doa.
Welcome, Ambassador. Welcome.
Yeah, we just check, we just test whether the
It's
system
working very
is,
well. It's
is
very,
functioning.
we can hear you and we can see you. We will start at 4 p.m. sharp.
Okay.
And anything we say now is already being live streamed. So we can just turn off our mics for now.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doa.
Hello, John.
Back again. I just had a better headset, so thank you.
Okay, very good. Very good. We can hear you and we can see you. Thank you very much. Can I ask all speakers to turn their cameras on, but to stay on mute, please? We will start in 2 minutes. Thank you very much. As we are recording, it would be great if you could keep your cameras on throughout the session, so the recording comes out well. But do please stay on mute until you're given the floor. We will start shortly. Welcome to the first session of the WTO Symposium on illicit trade in food and food fraud. This session is entitled Food Fraud, Emerging Issues and Future Trends. My name is Doa Abdelmotal. I'm Senior Counselor in the WTO Agriculture and Commodities Division, and I'll be moderating this session. I'll be putting 2 rounds of questions to our panelists, after which I'll be opening the floor to questions from you, the viewers. Viewers can send questions to dialogues@wto.org. I'd like to begin by providing some context for this particular session. In the opening panel, we heard from organizations such as Traceit on how food fraud and illicit trade in food endanger the Sustainable Development Goals. We heard from the International Seed Federation about how serious food fraud is in the seed sector. We heard from the UN Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute about the evolution of food crime and the challenges of holding fraudsters to account. And we heard from USDA/Codex about the US experience with food fraud and the evolution of international standards in this field. And finally, of course, we heard from the WTO on how the WTO rulebook interacts with all of these issues. In this session, we will now aim for a deeper dive into the topic of the symposium, looking at emerging issues and future trends. In other words, we will ask whether food fraud is static or dynamic and evolving, and what food fraud in the future might look like so we may better prepare ourselves. Part of preparing ourselves is to explore the role that technological advancement plays in fraud. Does it create more sophisticated opportunities for food manipulation, or does it instead enhance our ability to catch fraud, such as through blockchain technology and other and greater traceability, for instance? The session will also look at new foods, asking whether fraudsters are adapting and exploiting changing trends in food consumption. It will look at questions of environmental sustainability, asking whether the rising consumer demand for environmentally friendly and sustainable foods we face is increasing the risk of misleading claims. And it will look at the growth of e-commerce, asking whether the growth of the online marketplace presents new challenges, reducing perhaps physical oversight of food products. This is by no means an exhaustive list of future trends. It's just a sample of the issues that I hope we will address today. We're honored to have with us on this panel representatives from WTO members, the ambassador of China and the ambassador of Mauritius, who will hopefully be joining us soon, as well as a number of experts in the field. So please let me, without further ado, introduce our very distinguished panel to you. Marcus Slip is Senior Food Safety Officer in the Food Safety Division of the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization on behalf of Maximo Torero. Hello, Marcus, welcome. Quincy Lissauer is SAFE Executive Director. Welcome, Quincy. John Spink is Director of the Food Fraud Prevention Academy and Assistant Professor at Michigan State University. Hello, John. And Your Excellency, Ambassador Shengeng Li is Permanent Representative of China to the WTO. Your Excellency, welcome. Let me now open the first round of questions. John, I'd like to start with you. What do you see in the Food Fraud Prevention Academy as the emerging issues and future trends in food fraud? Is it technology, new foods, environmental sustainability, or something else perhaps?
Yeah, well, thank you. First, it's great to be here and appreciate the opportunity. It's been great to work with all of you. Doa, you've been great. Quincy, Jeff, two people I've been working with, and Michelle, your leadership on Codex has been really, really interesting over the years to get involved with. First, as an academy, we're trying to teach people, and education is one thing, but we've been focused on helping people actually take action. So it's people that have problems and getting into, really applying academic scholarly research. One thing that we see as the big trend, here it is. Drum roll, please. The more things change, the more things stay the same. It's very unsatisfying. We'd like to tell you what it is specifically, but what we mean is that the risks change, individual actions, but the vulnerabilities really have been the same over time. It's things where we have system weaknesses in place. And partially we have to step back in the bigger picture and look at this to say, first, let's be real. The world's under a lot of pressure. Human trafficking, wars, weapons smuggling, illegal drugs, and agri-foods. So we've got a lot of different challenges for us. And second, let's also be real that there are constrained resources everywhere. That leads to us to look at holistically what should we be doing, and prevention is really the most efficient way to act. And so when we look at emerging trends, we look at what we've learned to prevent that. And prevention really needs that focus at the core. We need to detect and deter, absolutely. And we need that action. It's important, but we need to judge those actions in relation to how it prevents. So we're really, really getting ahead of this. This is really not very different than global food safety focus on HACCP or public health, looking at reducing those root causes. I think when we look at prevention, also to think about why haven't we got here yet? In 1820, Frederick Acum wrote the first book and defined food fraud. So here we are 200 plus years later. What's different now? I think one thing we've seen is an interdisciplinary approach. So we've got criminology, not just catching bad guys, but looking at crime prevention. That's situational crime prevention, the space of crime. That's saying, like, what's the role of WTO and specific actions looking at routine activities and other things like that. And then supply chain, I'm hearing an echo, but hopefully that's okay. Supply chain management is a different aspect of that. I'm actually in the Department of Supply Chain Management. So my job every day is to look at value chain, supply chain vulnerabilities and visibility. So I think what we see is we've got a lot more perspective of what's going on. We're really aware of what's going on. And so it leads us to need to step back and look at the big picture and look at our specific roles. Earlier today, you heard from the USDA, and that's also with Codex. That's a great example to look at what's going on and what governments do. Like for us in the US, food fraud's been clearly illegal, all types of food fraud since at least 1938 with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. So what we look at is how we respond to that. And one thing that's great here is that when food fraud is found, there's quick response. And there's some very, very efficient responses, such as recalling product, seizing product. or closing an establishment. That gets the attention of business, let me tell you. So there's a lot of really quick actions. I think also public-private partnership has got to be key. And you'll hear from SSAFE Quincy next. SSAFE is a key group of getting industry involved at the start. And then finally, for prevention, what's new? I think it's us realizing we need meetings like this to talk about what's the scope, and that's specifically back to Michelle and her work on Codex. Defining the terms for us in a central place is really the crystal key starting point. And when we start with that, we've got the scope. We can then identify more clearly what are our roles. What are our roles in academia? What are our roles in intergovernmental organizations and others? With that, I'll conclude my remarks.
Thank you very much, John. Let me just take this opportunity to welcome the ambassador of Mauritius, who has just joined us. Welcome, Ambassador. It's an honor to have you with us. This is Ambassador Usha Chandni Dwarka Kanabadi, the permanent representative of Mauritius to the WTO. Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for joining us. John, your comments were excellent, and of course, we're honored to have you with us because your work has helped shape the international conversation around definitions of fraud. So we're very pleased that you could find the time, and very interesting in your remarks that you place the emphasis on prevention as the most efficient way to act. And I hope we will come back to this in this session. Quincy, let me now turn to you. How can the food industry best prepare itself for this fast evolving landscape, for new types of fraud, essentially?
Good morning, Doa. Greetings from Medellin, Colombia. Very pleased and happy to be here, particularly with this illustrious panel of the ambassadors, FAO, and obviously from the academic side, Michigan State University, and John. John and I have worked together on this topic probably for the better part of about 10 years. And surprise, surprise, there's a lot of alignment in what he says and the thinking within the SSAFE membership. Just a quick bit of background. SSAFE is a nonprofit organization focused on strengthening the safe supply and trade of food around the world. So with that focus, obviously, food fraud, food defense, and other areas of both intentional and unintentional adulteration are very much within the purview of the kind of work that we do as SSAFE. And as I said, there's a lot of alignment between what John said and where our thinking is as SSAFE as well. If I perhaps start with drawing a distinction between intentional and unintentional adulteration, I think it's important to understand that. When we're talking about unintentional adulteration, we're really talking around food safety, around making sure that both quality and food safety is driven through the entire process of making food before it gets to the consumer. Our focus here really is around intentional adulteration, and even that needs to be split up into two parts. Food defense and food fraud, where food defense really looks at protecting us from harm, where people try to utilize food for terrorist-style attacks on the food supply chain and really hurting consumers. What we're really focused on here today, and when we're talking around fraud, is still intentional adulteration, but for the purpose of making money. And there is a clear distinction between that. One of the key things that we've seen throughout the years is actually from a fraud perspective and adulteration for financial gain, the main driver is to keep it hidden as long as possible, because the longer that you keep it hidden, the more money that you're going to make, as opposed to food defense, where really the impact is supposed to be as quick and as great as possible. So having made that distinction to start with, that also therefore then takes a different kind of approach when we talk about fraud. And there again, we would usually split it between two parts. It is the prevention element, which has been our main focus. So the pre-fraud element, i.e. preparing yourself to try to avoid adulteration from occurring in the first place. And then secondly, post-fraud activities or detection. So when we're talking about the pre-fraud activities, we're really looking at how is a company vulnerable to fraudulent activity, both within their own organization as well as within their supply chain. How can they mitigate against that? What kind of plans can you put in place within your organization to really draw down those vulnerabilities as much as possible? We don't believe we'll ever be able to get down to the zero, but the stronger that your internal systems are and your reduction of your vulnerabilities of exposure towards fraud, the stronger you're going to be. Other key elements are strengthening your supply chain management, educating and training not only your internal staff, but also your external suppliers. Looking at your governance and risk systems. And again, this is an area where John has done a lot of work as well, and I'm sure he's going to touch upon it again later. Looking at new technologies and data that we can use to really help inform us on how we can...
I apologize. I think the ambassador of Mauritius is trying to join again, and she's not on mute.
That's okay. I think I was muted there for a minute. So again, going back, strengthening your supply chain, working closely with your suppliers to make sure of the authenticity of the products that you're getting in, doing a lot of training and education on that front. And then finally, the other element, and that's one that has been worked on extensively as well, is food safety culture. Looking at the culture within your organization. We know that a lot of the fraud that actually occurs within the actual direct sphere of influence of a food business, i.e. within your own four walls. That then said, the stronger that you make your culture within your organization, the bigger the reduction we will see in terms of fraudulent activity. Now, that's all in terms of prevention. The other aspect, obviously, is post-fraud activities. So detecting it from happening. So doing testing, investigations, as well as collaborating with authorities. Now, on the testing side, what we've always said is we can't test our way out of this. One, because we don't know what it is that we're testing for in many cases, right? We didn't really realize that we needed to test for horse meat in minced beef or for melamine in baby powder milk. So again, testing is good and it definitely helps, but it isn't the only solution. So then ultimately, and that goes back to the point that John made at the end of his statement as well, collaborating between all the different parties that have a relevant stake in this. So, and which is why we're also very glad and honored to be part of this particular group driven by the WTO, is the fact that we need to bring together regulators, the police, customs, the private sector, the national authorities, and individual experts to really join together to drive forward the systems that we need to really drive prevention and ultimately reduce fraud to the minimal aspect that we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Quincy. And I think you've created a very good framework for us, distinguishing between intentional and unintentional fraud and explaining the concept of food defense versus food fraud, and of course, the vulnerabilities for the private sector. So I'm sure we'll be building on that as this discussion moves forward. Marcus, I'd like to come to you. International trade in food has boomed over the past 2 decades, and supply chains have gotten longer. What are the weakest links in the global food supply chains that can be penetrated by fraudsters, and how problematic is this phenomenon in the developing world?
Thanks, Dora, and it's also my pleasure to be here at the fantastic panel, and I also know John and Quincy for years now, and we have spent much time together. So there is a certain overlap in our contributions. I think the question of food defense versus food fraud is absolutely critical to remember. We are talking here about food fraud. It would be a different discussion if we were talking about activities that are intended to harm. So having said that, one of the fundamental threats of food fraud is an aspect that John introduced early on, the question of definition. Because nobody but that person or the group of persons who commits that food fraud will understand what the end product is and how the composition is. So Quincy used the example of horse meat in minced beef. It didn't turn out to be a food safety problem, but it certainly was a food identity problem. We just didn't know. And this is always then resolved in retrospect, which leaves, of course, regulators and consumers in the dark as long as the food fraud is going on. And with that, we may have the one singular most critical item that any decisions about food safety, food quality, food identity is actually up to the group of people that commit the food fraud if and when fraud happens. So nobody else is included in this decision making. And that's the vulnerability that, of course, is unsettling to consumers, is unsettling to regulators, is unsettling to industry as a segment, as a whole group, not to the one person or a group of people that commits that fraud. But it's critical to remember that there's no country, no value chain, not a single product that is safe from food fraud. It doesn't matter where we look, where we go, because food fraud in many cases is perpetrated by people internal to the organization, as already mentioned by Quincy, and single-handedly driven by the opportunity, the willingness to act, the access and the means that that group of fraudster or that single person of a fraudster that he or she will find. So it's just very arbitrary in terms of planning, and it's unpredictable because it's that mixture of opportunity, willingness to act, means, and access that will determine whether fraud will or will not happen. And just like any other value chain, all parts of a modern agri-food system can be vulnerable to food fraud. By their very nature, fraudsters, of course, are trying to avoid detection. And this has led generally to a dearth, if you want, of information on food fraud, which makes it hard to establish how common the practice actually is. Not unique to food fraud, it's with all illegal activities that these estimates are difficult to make and have large uncertainties, of course. Individual stories of food fraud are easy to find. It's much harder to come up with a systematic estimate of the prevalence of this phenomenon. The increase in reported cases of food fraud that we have seen over the last years does not necessarily mean there's an increase in food fraud. It may just simply be connected to better success of detecting food fraud or the improvements of sharing such information. So we don't know, but it's a fallacy to equate the frequency of reporting with the frequency of occurrence. It may or may not be the case that this goes hand in hand, but it's not sufficient to just say there's more and more I read in the media, so it must happen more and more. Nevertheless, the lack of information makes it just very difficult to develop strategies as well as legal tools to respond to fraud. There are strategies, we've heard, prevention strategies and all of that. And that is absolutely true, but on the government side, it's the legal instruments that are actually at the disposal or not to a certain government that makes a difference. In countries with weak institutions that include legal and which includes the legal and the enforcement arm, the institutions, and in less formalized and more fragmented economies, there can be opportunities for food frauds. In addition, controlling the impact of such fraud, if and where it happens, on the consumer will be much more difficult due to limitations of the ability of the government to act. At the same time, often the net profits possible from illegal fraud in highly formalized and high-value commodity markets can be considerably more attractive. Thus, it may be fair to say that both high-income as well as low- and middle-income countries have their individual risk profiles when it comes to food fraud and will require focused and tailored strategies to respond. The more complex a value chain is in general, the more actors are involved. The more the probability increases for one of the involved actors to potentially succumb to the idea of doing fraudulent activities. And that's just the nature of, if things get more complicated, the opportunities increase and things to go wrong. Having said all of that, many low and middle income countries may face additional risks that stem from the insufficient legal framework that may provide the authorities with not enough instruments to swiftly and efficiently punish those that perpetrate fraud. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Thank you for speaking to the issue of food identity. Very often the problem is not a food safety issue, but a food identity issue. But that's an equally important issue for consumers, of course, and for trust in the marketplace. But I think very important also in your comments is the fact that we don't have proper estimates of how big this phenomenon is. We have a lot of anecdotes, we have a lot of individual stories, but we really, but there is, it's not easy to establish trends or to really understand the frequency. So I think it's important for viewers and for our WTO audience to be aware of where our knowledge stands today of this issue and what the limitations are. Your Excellency, Ambassador Li, I would like to come to you. What has China's experience been in fighting illicit trade in food and in food fraud? And can you provide us with concrete examples? Also, in China's experience, has food fraud been a moving target, with fraudsters always finding new strategies to evade the law?
Thank you. Thank you, Dora. It's my pleasure to be here to exchange views with distinguished colleagues and experts on this important issue. I will try to answer your question. As you all know, China has a large population and a big market. Food security has always been a priority for China's government. Persistent efforts have been made to ensure the food security for its people. In 2022, China's food safety sampling results showed the qualified rate was 97.11%. And the unqualified rate, of course, was 2.89%. China also notified 4,200 batches of imported food products substandard. There are huge regulatory challenges in food safety and trade due to China's huge consumption and diversification of production and imports. China hopes to strengthen our own regulatory work and expand collaboration with trade partners. In recent years, major safety concerns in China include the intentionally improper use or misuse of additives and the counterfeit and inferior good food in rural areas. For instance, there have been instances of adding medicinal substances to food, claiming therapeutic effects for health. To address such issues, the Chinese government has implemented a series of measures. For example, in order to prevent manufacturers from adding anti-inflammatory substances to food, the State Administration for Market Regulation has introduced a specific regulation to classify anti-inflammatory substances and the derivatives as toxic and harmful non-food materials. Any discovery of such substances in food can lead to criminal prosecution. With such measures taken, it not only deters manufacturers from engaging illegal productions, but also replace the lenient punishment or unclear punitive measures, which could lead to invasion of law or changes in strategies of manufacturers. In rural areas, supervision is strengthened on both the production and the market. The focus is on preventing the addition of edible substances to food, untested or inadequately inspected meat, unlabeled products, counterfeiting goods, trademark infringements, expired products, and false advertising of so-called health products. Key areas include for food wholesale markets, food production workshops, street vendors, small eateries, and so on. Any identity will be promptly dealt with according to the relevant laws and regulations. Moreover, information technology has been well introduced to enhance administrative capabilities. We have developed inspection method database for illegal additives enforcement, toxic and harmful substance determination reference database, food safety expert database, and a national toxic and harmful enforcement data sharing platform. We call it 3 databases and 1 platform for food law enforcement. All these facilitate the sharing of various enforcement inspection methods and toxic substance determination opinions. The IT application greatly helps to guide different levels of agencies in recognizing new types of illegal additions, coordinating efforts between administrative law enforcement and criminal justice. It also increased the transparency and the public awareness. Smart supervision is also applied nationally, such as the quick response QR code cursor interception system, which greatly improves the efficiency and prevents the circulation of illegal food in the market. Besides, the system of data platform and electronic supervision methods also effectively prevents violators from evading the law by continuously changing their tactics. In general, to ensure food safety requires continuous efforts in regulatory measures and the implementation. In the meantime, it also needs public support. In this regard, enhancing public awareness is also very important. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Li. Clearly, as you said, China has a very large population, so food fraud can quickly become a very big problem in China, affecting large numbers of people. And as you've mentioned that there is now criminal prosecution, there are IT tools, there are a range of instruments that China is using to combat the issue. So thank you for that overview. I'd like to turn to the Ambassador of Mauritius now, Ambassador Dwarka Kanabadi. What has been Mauritius's experience with illicit trade and food fraud? Could you also give us some specific examples, if you can, and challenges? Walk us through some of the challenges the developing and least developed countries face in this area.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and I apologize for all the technical problems. But as I was explaining to you, today is a very big day for the commemoration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we've all been in the party trying to fit in this, rushing down to be able to address you. So I apologize to Marcus and to John and to Quincy if I interrupted your interventions. I must tell the 3 of you that I'm just a boring ambassador who doesn't understand this. She only knows what she knows. So from there, I'll share with you what my feeling is. You know, the question of food fraud. I think ever since we were kids, we all know the story of your mom going to the milkman because at that time there were no bottles and saying, why have you put so much water in the milk? It started with the adulteration of milk. That is one range of food fraud at that time, which probably seems very mundane to you, but it's probably the most common form of food adulteration. to the other extreme, where you become a party to illicit, to food fraud or illicit trade in food because you're not responsible for every product that you make. I'll give an example. The famous Sudan 4 dye. We used to import red chilies from India. These were colored by Sudan 4 dyes, and we use it to create our own masala spices, and we export it. And suddenly we get this warning from the European Union saying, oh, you've used the wrong dye. But then you're not a country that produces all this. You're just bringing together things that you're assembling, and you find the one component that you have there which is not quite right. And then, of course, you have the different kind of food fraud. We've seen the smuggling of sugar in the Eastern African market, which displaces normal sugar produced and exported by Mauritius due to either, for a number of reasons, the smuggling itself, but also sometimes prices given, export subsidies given by others to be able to undercut your own prices on that one. And, there are times, I think the one scandal that worried Mauritius a lot was the question of melamine in milk at one time, which really hurt a lot of countries. And Mauritius being small as compared to Chang'an, with a very big country, everybody hears everything very quickly. The media simply has to spell something out, and then there's a big panic on this one. So Mauritius has made a lot of effort since then, and I'm happy to share it later with you with all that we have done. But let me share with you, for example, the latest rumor or the latest concern that people have. If you were to import food from Ukraine, they're like, what? With all the fighting going on there and all that bombing going on, heaven knows what's on those vegetables that you're importing. And here you are as a mark of solidarity trying to import food, and you don't know what the effects are. I believe till today that the difficult challenges that small countries like us face is the question of absence of knowledge about food safety. You don't really know. And you really have to make a huge effort to invest in equipment and in laboratories to be able to do this. You need the infrastructure. Then you will need the capacity to go with it, which is why you work with international organizations. You don't get there. But then the capacity also to understand international norms and to implement them. And perhaps the biggest of this is incapacity to be one of those that formulates those norms. We saw, for example, in some cases, misunderstanding between terminology can create so many difficulties on this. But I want to share something with you, and especially with the three technicians that struck me recently. I was a discussant for a number of Central African countries, and it struck me that a number of them do not even have an SPS lab. So how do you know what you're importing, who is testing what, who is looking at what, and what are you eating? The most common form in most developing countries of food fraud is relabeling. The moment the product which hits that expiry date, you just remove the label and add a new label, and it's not always easily detectable. And we have these theories like tea never expires, so you can prolong the date of the tea and the length of its shelf life on that one. So, I mean, these might sound very minor as compared to what you're doing, but these are the real issues on the ground in the smaller countries and developing countries. I'm happy to add more to if you ask me.
Thank you very much, ambassadors, for this very thoughtful intervention. And we understand what a busy day it is for you, of course. So thank you for making time for this webinar. Your comments have been very useful, in particular, your reference to media and panic. And indeed, this is a big problem with this issue, that as soon as a scandal hits the news, consumers panic, governments panic. And of course, it is presumed that the scandal or that the incident is much wider than it actually is. And this is part of the challenge here, communication. But thank you also for your reference to formulating norms and to the need for the developing world to be part of that formulation and of that process. Let me open the second round of questions. Marcus, I'd like to start with you. From your vantage point as FAO, what are the best regulatory strategies for food fraud at the country, regional, and global levels? And what, in your view, can the WTO do?
Thanks, Dora. Great question. So countries, of course, have a whole range of legal measures at their disposal to combat food fraud. And what exactly a specific country can do would depend very much on the national context. There are various ways to get to the same goal, but all these measures begin with the enactment of a robust food safety and quality legislation, which must clearly define the roles and responsibilities of the various stakeholders in the food supply chain. And this legislation, excuse me, this legislation needs to also establish robust institutions. And in addition, or as a hallmark of a robustness of the institution, empower them to efficiently detect and combat food safety problems in general, but in particular here for the discussion, food fraud. Which means also access to food, the ability to recall foods, and all these hallmarks that have been mentioned by others already, that are necessary to combat food fraud. So beyond the food safety and quality laws, other instruments and other institutions and legal instruments can play a rather significant role in combating food fraud. These may encompass legal aspects like consumer protection laws, but also regulatory mechanisms for border control and effective penalties and criminal sanctions, of course, for perpetrators. In today's interconnected world, the coordination and data sharing among competent authorities, as well as the collaboration with the private sector, will be instrumental components of a sound food quality control and food safety control. WTO does play and must play a pivotal role in addressing food fraud. Trade law serves to facilitate the safe and secure import and export of food, and also to prevent unnecessary restrictive controls, while allowing appropriate controls, of course. To find this balance is at the core of WTO, at least as far as it gets to food fraud. And trade law serves to provide clarity on the rules of governing international food fraud, including regulatory mechanisms for monitoring food safety at both its points of origin and at international borders whenever it's passing through a border. The combination of such international rules and sanitary measures and the technical barriers to trade, together with instruments and facilities for trade facilitation, does and will help countries to balance their use of trade restrictions on the one hand and border controls on the other. Trade law also facilitates collaboration among countries to create an environment of transparency and traceability, both of being vital to combat food fraud. So the opportunities for WTO and its members, we believe, are plentiful, and we are much looking forward to continue to see WTO support in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Coordination, data sharing, thank you. Very important points. And thank you also for highlighting how important the role of the WTO can be in this space. In terms of finding the balance between supporting control measures, but disciplining, if you will, measures that would unnecessarily restrict trade. But of course, on issues like transparency, traceability, etc., the WTO has an important role. Quincy, let me come back to you. From the private sector point of view, how can the WTO assist in the fight against food fraud? In particular, what role do agreements such as the WTO agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures play, and how can they best keep up with change?
Thanks, Doe. And I think Marcus already mentioned quite a bit of this. I think we do agree that the WTO and trade play a key role in trying to help prevent fraud occurring across the global food supply chain, particularly also the work in collaboration with Customs and Border, with Interpol, Europol, and other such institutions is vital in order to drive down fraudulent activity across the world. I think it kind of comes back to the point I was trying to make earlier, that the more that key stakeholders across the industry, and that is both public and private sector work together, the more likely it is that fraudulent activity is going to get reduced. The Codex Alimentarius and their current work on food fraud, therefore, is also imperative, particularly also because it underpins the sanitary, phytosanitary agreements, the SBS agreements, which then are in turn recognized by the WTO for trade issues. So the more that we strengthen those aspects that ultimately underpin national and international law and regulatory systems around the world, the more that the food industry subsequently has available to it in order to be able to combat food fraud. Given that the WTO recognizes those Codex standards as a basis from which global trade is governed, this framework and these standards are fundamental in creating a common baseline, which then ultimately companies across the food sector can use in order to both import and export, as well as compete in an open market. As I said, we believe that the WTO can, should, and does play a fundamental role alongside other key stakeholders to strengthen the supply of authentic food. Through its trade facilitation and SPS agreements, the WTO has a fantastic opportunity to bring together governments, the private sector, law enforcement, and technical experts to work together on identifying gaps and proactively develop the necessary tools that we need, both legislative and otherwise, to combat food fraud. Beyond the WTO, customs, law enforcement are fundamental for the authenticity of the food system, and therefore closely working together with them, as well as the private sector, is very helpful in ensuring that fraudsters, especially those that operate across borders, are arrested, prosecuted, and in turn serve as a deterrent as well. Ultimately, our view is that the more that we collaborate between the WTO, customs, law enforcement, Codex, the private sector, the stronger we are going to be in order to meet our joint responsibility to reduce fraud across the world and continue to protect consumers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Quincy. And indeed, WTO has a role to play in increasing the supply of authentic food. And thank you also for mentioning that the WTO can act as a convener, as we're doing in this webinar, and hopefully we can take this effort further for conversations between the different stakeholders in this debate. And hopefully we'll come back to the role of the WTO in the rest of this session. John, let me come back to you. As the head of the Food Fraud Prevention Academy, can you explain to us how food fraud can be prevented as opposed to controlled, and walk us through some of the tools?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the core of what I do every day, all day. So I wrote a book, entire book on food fraud prevention. So if you ever get have a lack of reading, actually for the beaches in Mauritius, I'd like to offer to come visit you. So please invite me, especially midwinter here in the north. But the key is stepping back to look at the big picture and to look at it from the problem outwards. To look at it from the food itself outwards. We all have a role. We want to act. We want to move forward, but it's that role of taking a step back to say, what is our role? And I've got a really unique perspective because as a faculty member, I started in the School of Packaging. And then I was in School of Criminal Justice. So writing in those areas, studying those areas, so understanding the bad guy. And then food safety, specifically food safety, not just food science, but food safety. And then now I'm in the business college in the supply chain management. So when we talk about value chain, supply chain vulnerabilities, this is what I do every day. Yesterday, 900 students in the auditorium were talking about value chains specifically. Exams are next week, so they're pretty excited about that. But the thing is, we look at all this and look at how we can be most efficient. The last piece is really risk. I would say risk decision-making, not risk management, not risk communications, risk decision-making, because we all have limited resources. So the question gets to be, what do we do with our specific resource? You look at people on the line here. So we've got two countries. So let's say import and export there. We've got the WHO, we've got WTO, we've got industry, and got ourselves academia. So we're the players that really need to come together really in equal footing at the start because we all have different roles. WTO has a specific role that industry cannot take on. At the same time, industry has some roles WTO cannot. So we really need to step back and be efficient. And I'll say, even with China, so there's evidently that says food safety in China. Dr. Chen and Dr. Yongning Wu were co-authors on our food fraud chapter. It's looking at big picture from different perspectives. When we look at prevention, really, I would say also I challenge our group is if the result of this meeting is that we go from the 2nd to the 3rd annual symposium, and it's for the next time we've seen each other, we have not been in leadership roles. So we need to look at what's next. That's us as individuals, I think, connecting. Now everybody's got different food fraud is some parts of more or less than a role for other people. So that's a bit of us figuring out what are the reality of what are our resources. But just to think in the big picture, we cannot test our way to food safety, and we're not going to enforce, prosecute, or regulate our way to food fraud prevention. We need to look at the prevention piece of that. Thomas Jefferson here in the U.S. said, no vice was solved from the supply side, something like that. And so we need to look again at prevention. We need to reduce the opportunities for people. And that's like Mauritius being aware of what might come in to be able to looking for that, to lead people to think, don't send that to Mauritius. They might catch it. That's a real key. So when we look at this, the bottom line is the most simple is a vulnerability assessment. So to think of country level, we actually did this with Trinidad and Tobago. We did a 4-hour workshop covering all internal incoming and outgoing goods. Now, was it very high level and light? Yeah. Did it need a lot more work? Absolutely. But they have a vulnerability assessment for their entire country. At that point, they can prioritize. They specifically pick the issues that you're worried about. Mauritius mentioned a couple. You start with those, add a couple more. Then all of a sudden you can prioritize which ones. What would be the perfect test? What would be the ideal test to have the maximum impact? We all have limited resources. We don't have to prevent everything, but that's a key is looking at that. That would be looking at the big picture. Why haven't we done this before? Again, 1820 is when Frederick Acum defined this. It's because we're now much more interdisciplinary in the way that we study from our end and interact. We're nicer about crossing borders intellectually. So we have an interdisciplinary approach. And that I mentioned too is that supply chain approach at the end. It's product moving in a supply chain. We need to understand the complexities and the efficiencies. Product needs to move fast. Let me tell you, that's the big thing. The science of supply chain management, is it moving fast? And we want to have fresher product moving farther around the world faster. We want to have it come from more rural areas of the US, of China, of Mauritius, and move to those other areas faster. So supply chains have to move. And so that's a key there of that discipline. Interdisciplinary is criminal justice, understanding the fraud opportunity. Uniquely mentioned a lot of really fabulous activities there, but it's understanding the fraudster. And then at the end is still this whole enterprise-wide look to do that assessment at the high level and prioritize. And once we do identify where those real system weaknesses are and things then we want to work where we can act. If the best prevention for you is to lock your front door before you leave your house today, then that's what you do. If the best action is for you to turn on your alarm in your house or whatever it is, then take a different route to work. Then we want to look on what's efficient. Basically, we got here and this need for the vulnerability assessments, which sounds really light to say, well, how could I do it for an agency or country? But we have to start. If you don't have a real priority, then a risk setting mechanism, then you don't know, you can't justify if you're really working on the most important action and the most efficient countermeasure. We just respond. Now, this is also something that actually tomorrow is Interpol Operation Opsin. I'm presenting to them virtually, and it's on country level vulnerability assessments because they're looking at prioritizing the resources. They're looking at ops. I think it's 13th or 14th year of what was done last year. Let's adjust, use those resources. So that's tomorrow with Interpol, Europol. Actually, I think it was 2017 when I first presented a country level assessment to them. So it's there. I don't know what page it is in the book, but it has occurred. It can happen. We can do it. I think the EU has best practice with honey. It's been absolutely amazing to see the results with the honey. They looked at the honey supply chain, they identified the gaps, and they looked at which agencies, there's a key again, which agencies are most efficient at which part of the supply chain. So kind of the conclusion piece is then my role is not just to say what's wrong and list a number. It's to say, what should we do about it? And practical, understanding China has different resources than Mauritius, than WTO, than industry, than everybody. Everyone's got different resources, and we're all constrained. But actually, it's a new article. Our discussions and others have led to an article that's under review now on the role of intergovernmental organizations in food fraud prevention specifically. That's not a governmental organization, that's intergovernmental. And in that, a real key is looking at, as I wrap up here, starting out with an incident review. That's very simple. So let's think Mauritius as you're sitting there, as I see you on the screen. What are the top 5 issues? So you start with that. That's your incident review. Then we look at the details. How did it get there? What are the public health threats? What are the economic threats? If you're passing it on, exporting it, that's different than if it's just used there. That's looking at the risk. Then you rank order them. Which ones are the most concerning for you as a society, public health, economic? You've got to start with that priority. And then consider the countermeasures. Some things are very simple. Some things aren't. And some things will shut down fraud immediately. Some things won't. So you'd like to implement the ones that are most efficient. Maybe get 80% of the way there in one action, and then you can work on the rest. At least you got 80% of the way. Then the last 2 points are really then a strategy, an ongoing strategy. If you just do that once, that's not a strategy. A strategy is ongoing. It's continuing to review it, looking for changes, like Interpol Operation Opsin is doing. Europol Opsin is looking at refining. Constantly refining, and that's plan, do, check, act, and you continue to review. So, WTO absolutely has a role, as does WHO, as industry, as Mauritius, as China, as academia, as Interpol, Europol. We just need to figure out what's the big vulnerability in the supply chain and what is our specific role. Then we can be very efficient in the way that we operate. So that's a big picture.
Thank you very much, John. This was indeed a very big picture intervention, but incredibly helpful for us going forward. You've put the emphasis on vulnerability assessment, which should really be central to our thinking in the WTO as we look at global value chains. And you very rightly pointed out that we need to look at the major incidents, perhaps, that have gone through these global value chains and to see what the entry points were and how they can be countered. So we begin to move from raising awareness about the issue to finding solutions. Thank you. Ambassador Lee, I'll come back to you. So what steps is China taking to deal with illicit trade? You've gone through some of those issues in your earlier intervention, but if you could perhaps zoom in on the policy toolbox that China is using, that would be incredibly helpful. Also, how, in your view, can WTO rules and the WTO as an institution assist countries like China in this battle? Ambassador, you're muted.
Yeah. Thank you. Regarding your question, compared with some developed economies, I have to admit that our toolbox for food safety still needs further enhanced. Anyhow, now we do have quite a comprehensive set of tools in order to address food safety. First, a robust legal system has been established during the past 2 decades. Food safety law is a fundamental guidance regarding food safety in China. It outlines basic principles and the legal system of food safety. It also regulates the responsibilities of food producers and operators, stands the establishment for food quality and safety, and inspection and testing systems. According to food safety law, a series of regulations for implementation are stimulated, such as national standards for food safety, measures for the supervision and administration of food safety, measures for the administration of food safety labels, and the regulation on the safety management of imported and exported foods and etc. Such a comprehensive legal system provides a legal basis to guide and supervise food safety management. Secondly, specific actions are taken to address dedicated food safety issues, including initiating targeted campaigns nationwide, addressing illicit additives and food unsafety in rural areas are examples of such targeted campaigns. The typical cases will also be made public in order to deter illegal food activities and also to raise public awareness. Third, coordination and cooperation among administrations are critical. In China, the State Administration for Market Regulation is directly responsible for food safety issues. But in practice, it needs support from other agencies. For example, the campaign on rural counterfeit and inferior food products was jointly launched by the State Administration for Market Regulation, together with the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Public Security, the Ministry of Commerce, the State Intellectual Property Office, and the All China Federation of Supply and Marketing Cooperatives. Fourth, information technology gives strong support, of course. The IT further enhances the information sharing and the quick and coordinated response of the administration, such as the 3 databases and 1 platform I just now mentioned already launched. Also, the IT application also can play a role of supervision as we use QR code interception system to prevent the illicit food. Fifth, as a daily supervision, the sampling and the monitoring have been emphasized. For non-compliant food products identified through sampling and monitoring, local market regulatory authorities will promptly urge food production and business enterprises to take measures such as removal from the shelves and recalls. Administrative penalties or even criminal justice disposition will be taken in accordance with the laws and the regulations. On food security, besides members' individual efforts, international cooperation is also very important. In this regard, China always believes WTO could have a big role to play. For example, the TBT committee, the SPS committees are very relevant bodies and could be better used. Discussions could start on how to enhance the regulatory cooperation among members, such as information and experience sharing. Also, international trade is an integral part for food security. Customs cooperation to ensure free and smooth flow of safe food will greatly complement importing members' internal efforts in food safety. WTO can also play its role in it. Besides the discussions in the regular bodies, thematic sessions on specific topics and cross-cutting issues could also be held. I hope we can better use the WTO's relevant bodies to further enhance our cooperation in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, first of all, for walking us through what China is doing. And it's quite impressive, although, as you said, of course, that toolbox needs to evolve and it needs further work. But also, thank you for setting out the beginnings of a menu for what the WTO can do, whether in terms of regulatory cooperation in the TBT and SPS committees, cooperation amongst customs officials, etc. So I'm sure we will be building on all of that after the symposium. I'd like now to turn to the Ambassador of Mauritius, Ambassador Dwarka Kanabadi. I'd like to come back to you and to ask you the same question that I have just put to China. What steps is Mauritius taking to deal with illicit trade in food and food fraud, the policy toolbox that it's using, and what can the WTO do in this space to help Mauritius and countries like Mauritius? Thank you.
I apologize. I'm not sure I can answer that totally without pie. There's first the food that we export. HACCP in Mauritius had not been mandatory for a long time. But then, it was practiced by large food exporters, by businesses, etc. Now, since the Food Act 2022, it has become mandatory in certain categories of business. In fact, it was people who export tend to be more conscious of international standards. So obviously they would apply it. But the local man who sells you some fritters is not going to be so much concerned. Now he's going to be concerned about it. So, for example, one of the things that happened in the past, which I consider to be food fraud, was the export of fruit. Mauritius export papayas, lychees, mangoes, etc. And there is this tendency to cut corners in the past, which happens less now, is to pick them when they're not totally ripe, and then to apply heavy doses of ripeners with the hope that they will be ripe when they reach there. So that has happened, and we've been flagged for this, and now I can say that this is much better looked after. But what we have is an inspectorate called the Public Health and Food Safety Inspectorate. They do a lot of checks on samples, etc. And we have some good stories to tell. I mean, the Food Technology Laboratory of Mauritius, which was created a very long time ago, and which is basically a one-stop shop for food testing. They became a COMESA reference laboratory for food safety in 2008 with the relevant ISO standards. So in the region, they would come to Mauritius in case they would need to do some testing. I think this is where you want to build, and this is where you want to work with others. And for example, recently the biomolecular unit that undertakes activity on salmonella, testing for listeria, etc. They have since August this year, actually started working with the FAO on GMOs and consolidate, for example, sensory evaluation for these products. We work a lot with other people. So FAO, WHO on food control system, assessment tool, which has now been launched, FAO, IAEA, and IAEA is always a very good story in Mauritius. The International Atomic Energy Agency has just completed a project which allows us to verify the authenticity of food, and then also to provide rapid responses in cases of emergencies. And I mean, one of the things they did was to train 482 analysts in 1 year to be able to understand how to undertake testing, etc. So my response coming to WTO is, look, there is the International Atomic Energy Agency there, which has been helping us for years now create more resilient crops to climate change, which has been helping us using isotopes to do better evaluations and assessments. WTO doesn't have this technical expertise to do that, but they do for us a lot of SPS workshops, for example, to sensitize people. I wish they could do one thing for me if I could ask this, And it's a very practical thing. Could someone here work with other organizations and just tell me who does what kind of training? So when I look, I can have those little books that John was referring to and saying, this is what we're doing, guys. I mean, when we're simple ambassadors trying to find a way for our countries, we want simplicity. Tell us, we have this problem. Okay, let's have this whole compendium and tell me FAO this, IAEA this, etc. So I know where to go. I spend too much time finding my way around all this labyrinth of people wanting to help us, but not quite knowing on which door to knock sometimes on this. We have, I said, some very good stories to tell. For example, if you look at the number of tests for a small country like Mauritius, the Livestock and Veterinary Division last year, they ran 2,900 tests on food products. On dairy alone, dairy unit, 800 tests on 144 samples. So we're a testing country. We're a country that checks what it's eating, and people refer things when they're not happy. And we had this very unfortunate incident. I didn't want to refer to it. We had one person who decided he could sell any kind of meat. And he was selling any kind of meat at one moment. And after that, when he was discovered, he never sold meat again. So we are sensitive to this kind of thing. And the media plays a very important role. So WTO, if you could help us simplify things, that would help very much. Thank you. Thank you, Doa.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And indeed, we should give some very serious thought to the proposal that you've put on the table of helping countries understand which international organization does what and how different international organizations can support countries in this fight. But thank you also for the examples that you've given of of how certain operators try to cut corners. I think that's also very helpful in terms of making this more visual as a problem. We have a lot of questions from viewers. I think we have enough time probably for one question per panelist. John, let me start with you. There's a question to you from Germany saying, a person who's familiar with your work on definitions saying are different definitions across different jurisdictions a problem in terms of fighting illegal trade at the international level?
The simple answer is yes. The key is that at the very beginning, I mean, I constantly, I drive people crazy. And I did this all through my career when I was working in industry, is I'd say, what do you mean by that? How do you define it? What's the scope? I said, well, everybody knows what that is. And say, well, does it mean this? Well, it doesn't mean that. And so that the real key is at the very beginning, whatever project you're on, some people refer to food crime, food fraud, food adulteration, food authenticity. The key at the very beginning is to just define the scope, have a glossary, define the term. And that's the key role. I'll emphasize again, the role of Codex, the electronic working group, is absolutely critical to do the most simple thing. I mean, we've been going years in that group because sometimes it expands into more like what are countermeasures, and then it goes back and forth. But at the very beginning, we need to first define the terms. And I think for every activity, every report have a glossary, because at that point, then we know whatever you want to call it, does it include this? So that's the key, the key starting point. And from that, then is when we take that, we've now got the scope. At that point, then we'd look at a vulnerability. What is the vulnerability? Well, everybody knows what that is. Well, no, we don't, because is it death? Is it illness? Is it economic? Is it export? Is it import? Is it domestic only? So we need to then even define what are those vulnerabilities. And then when we set priorities, Mauritius mentioned that agency is public health and food safety. That's not law enforcement. That's not commercial crime unit. That agency's focus and the priority would be on the public health. The World Health Organization. Marcus and I have talked about this before over the years. World Health, the focus is on health and public health. So everything prioritizes on that first. That's different than UNICRI. UNICRI has a different focus. So I think those definitions are critical because we need to know what the scope, what we're talking about. And then also, if we don't set a common definition, that's okay, because the key is we can still just say, what do you mean by Quincy? What do you mean by that? And so we need to start with that. And again, I think this forum is excellent for that. Even when we talk about the title, is it illicit food and food fraud, or is it illicit food or food fraud? Are those two different things? To even define what our scope is. And so at the very beginning, it is key to define. Well, it's to define how we define the term, because we need to know the scope, and at that point, then we can identify who has the resources and how can efficiently move forward.
Thank you very much, John. Quincy, a question to you from Japan. A viewer is saying, given all your work on vulnerability assessment, what are the main entry points that you've seen and main points of vulnerability in the private sector? Are there any commonalities?
Well, that's a very good and very loaded question. So unfortunately, through the tool that we have, because all the data is anonymized, we don't have any specific individual data that is measurable across the 50 individual measures that are within the tool. That said, however, if you look at the questions itself, they're really divided into 3 different parts. And I would say that probably about a third of the questions are around people and behaviors, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, culture is that important. When the majority of fraud is actually caused within the direct sphere of your own influence, i.e. within your own 4 walls, the culture and how you operate your business, both locally as well as internationally, is absolutely fundamental. So that is one of the key areas where we know that we can strengthen specific things. Then if you look at specific data from organizations like the Food Authenticity Network and other great organizations that make some of the data publicly available, the categories usually tend to be the same, right? What are we really talking about here? We're talking about alcohol, we're talking about fisheries or aquaculture, we're talking about dairy, we're talking about meats, and then oils, honey. Those tend to be the main categories within which we know and continue to see fraud occurring. Given the fact that they don't tend to change a lot, I think that that is really an area where both the public and the private sector can work closer together to try to close those particular loopholes that ultimately lead to and cause fraudulent activity to occur. So I think that if you focus on those two things, we're already well along the way. Of course, it is a long process. It's never going to go away completely. So what is it that we can do to close those loopholes as much as possible, protect ourselves, both from an economic perspective, as well as protect the consumers from a food safety and from a knowing and expecting to get what it is that you pay for at the till perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Marcus, let me come to you. There's a question from a viewer in France who was interested in your comments on identity, food identity. And the viewer is asking whether international standards can be built around food identity issues and labeling. Can you tell us what you know about this area of work?
Thank you, and my thanks to the asker of this question, of course. Yes, standards can help. At the same time, food fraud is actually a violation of a standard, right? Food fraud exists when there is a standard and the standard is violated. So we all agree to what milk is or what orange juice is or whatever it is. And then this standard is being violated. So in a way, the more there are standards, the more food fraud will be observable. Now, at the same time, it doesn't mean that everything that was labeled to be orange juice, whether there is a standard or not, was not diluted with water before. It is just that common understanding that is developed that then will emerge and can be violated. Standards are an incredibly good tool to facilitate trade because it creates a common understanding. At the same time, standards can wash out regional differences or preferences because similar products have been handled differently in different regions or different countries or different cultures. So if there is suddenly one international standard that's the same for everything, that has benefits and drawbacks. I think there needs to be a very careful analysis of when standards are necessary, when they will help facilitate trade, when they will help food safety. Maybe they always help food safety, but when they will help facilitate trade, when they will help the national industry, and where they may have effects that need to be carefully considered before such an international standard is developed, because it may disenfranchise certain populations, certain regions, certain groups that suddenly do not comply with that standard anymore, despite indigenous knowledge or strong cultures and long terms of use of certain things. So on the wider the application of that standard, of course, the more problematic this becomes, and hence with international standard, with standards at the Codex Alimentarius level, this is probably the widest scope there is, and hence the most difficult, potentially, discussions to find the right verbiage and the right words that describe a standard sufficiently well, or that a standard is describing a product sufficiently well, but also not insufficiently tight and narrowly. It will require careful considerations and needs to be compatible with the tools that are available, applicable in countries. So the legal systems in countries are critical, of course, and the trade laws. So, complicated answer, sorry, but I don't think there's an easy answer for that.
Thank you for that. Ambassador Lee, I'd like to come to you, and there's a question to you from a viewer in Argentina who is saying, China has now become the largest net food importing country. So is some of the fraud coming into China, the viewer is asking, through imports? And how is China dealing with that?
Thank you for your question. Yes, you're right. Now China is a net importing country for food, and so we are very much pay attention to the food security issue. Just now, I already shared this year China notified 4,200 batches of imported food products substandard. So in China, we have a systematic arrangement to manage the food security, food safety issue in for imported goods. If there's some problem happened, there will be a very prompt information sharing among the relevant agencies. And also, the Chinese Customs Agency will notify the importer and exporter, because this kind of issue should be dealt with collective efforts among the agency, the Chinese agencies, and the stakeholders, the importers and the exporters. So we will follow the regular practice, international practice to address this kind of issue. Of course, in order to avoid frequently happen this kind of problems, China also strengthened the cooperation with our trading partners between the relevant authorities. We have some kind of arrangement to conduct information sharing, to give a very prompt notice to the exporter, importer, and also we also strengthen our inspection system. This is very important. Only with a very effective and scientific inspection system, we can identify what are the problems. So I think just like any other countries, this kind of issue is always not easy. China, as a big importers, will continually strengthen our capability and strengthen our cooperation with our trading partners and also the relevant international organizations to more effectively to address these kind of challenges. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Lee. And I'd like to apologize to viewers who have sent in questions to the Ambassador of Mauritius since she has had to leave us. This gives us time for just one or two more questions to the panelists who are still with us. John, there is a question to you. This is a viewer in Italy who is asking about the extent of the food fraud you've seen that has to do with animal welfare and environmental sustainability standards. How prevalent are false claims in those areas?
Wow, that's very detailed. I think that from the big picture, that's a great question for us to look at how we all are looking at food fraud and prevention. So a very key starting point is very, very specific actions and activities. So this probably leads from a couple incidents that the author there wrote about. And that would be what we'd need to do. We need to go look at those specific incidents, what occurred, what was the problem, what was the impact on it, and then how that product moved through the supply chains. At that point, we look at when that product crossed a border or was received, what enabled it to cross the border. Was that just someone didn't know how to check the label? Maybe it wasn't illegal in the country of receipt. So we have to get to the details to look at why and how the fraud occurred. So tomorrow in the Europol Opsin meeting, I'm talking about geographical origins, and that's a real key. At the very beginning, you need to first identify the details of the incident. It's called the Food Fraud Suspicious Activity Report Method. It's a survey that identifies what law has been violated. Do you have a sample? Do you have a source? It's good. Basically, it's a law enforcement crime fighting checklist. And crime fighters do not assume anything. That if all five of us are here and someone, if it was a murder mystery, they would not assume any one of us is guilty or innocent until they look at specific facts. And that's what we need to do, lay out exactly what occurred, how it occurred, why it occurred, and then we can go back and look. So to get kind of in a roundabout way back to the question, it's really critical to identify specific problems, but also really critical to identify the entire network, what occurred, where it occurred, the impact, and then things like laws and regulations. So there might be a point where WTO, the key role of WTO is to clarify to the importing country that this is illegal under one law or another. Maybe the importing country, the customs agency, is looking at only one set of rules. Maybe they're only looking at food safety. Then they might miss it. And if they're only looking at geographical claims, they might miss the sustainability claim. They might miss a different claim. So again, the key is for us to step back first and look at the entire system and look at what that weakness was. A lot of times it is communication, or let's be fair, the country that's receiving it. Maybe there's a food security crisis. Are you really telling me that we should stop product at the border? Okay, let's say there's people starving to death. Now let's say if the product is not spoiled, but the expiration date has passed, or the best buy date has passed, we've got a lot of decisions to make that are big. So the key is getting all information together and look. You can do this very quickly, but the key is looking at the information.
Doa, do you mind if I add a few words to this particular topic? Because it's one that SSAFE has worked on extensively. We've probably been working on animal welfare for the past 15 years or so. And obviously, the standards for animal welfare themselves sit within a different part. They sit with the World Organization of Animal Health, WOA. Nonetheless, what we're talking about here really is claims. And one of the challenges that we have in the animal welfare space, based on a study that we conducted last year, there's over 250 different animal welfare programs that lead to animal welfare claims around the world. Nonetheless, there isn't a global standard around claims either within WOA or within Codex at this particular point in time, which makes it very difficult from a global perspective to put some governance around this, or even for the WTO to do anything around this, because it doesn't get covered under the SPS agreements. As such, one of the things that SSAFE has been a big proponent of over the last few years is to drive harmonization when it comes to global standardization around animal welfare. That will not only allow us then to have a common baseline around the world, but will then also allow authorities to really step in when false claims are actually made based on a common baseline upon which we should be driving animal welfare. And that is one of the areas where I can see a lot of work happening over the next 5 years. It goes beyond animal welfare. Sustainability claims are another area. We do know that Codex is likely to start work on claims. They've already started that on the sustainability space, and hopefully animal welfare will get included in that as well. Nonetheless, that is a long process and likely to take 3 to 5 years minimum, we believe, but it is one that is much necessary.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for all the information and the wealth of knowledge that you've shared with us in this session. I'm sure this has been extremely useful for WTO members. So thank you very much. And the WTO will certainly be back in touch with all of you. And Ambassador, we would also love to take this work further with you. So we will be in touch after this 2-day event to see what next steps we can take. We've now come to the end of this session. I'd like to ask our viewers to join us tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. CET. For the session on business perspectives. You can use the live stream link that is specific to that session, which you can find in the program of the event, or you can also join the event through the WTO's annual Agriculture Symposium webpage. So a big thank you to all the speakers, and I'd like to thank all our viewers who have tuned in from different parts of the globe and across time zones. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you.